Lady Cordelia Ashworth stood at the altar in ivory silk, her trembling hand accepting Lord Reginald Pemberton's ring, while her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Across the crowded chapel, Nathaniel Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest, watched from the shadows, his grey eyes burning with 3 years of unspoken regret. The man who had abandoned her without explanation now witnessed her marry another for duty's sake, her family's debts demanding this sacrifice. But as the rector pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel's jaw tightened with deadly resolve. Honor had failed him once. Tomorrow at dawn, pistols would give him one final chance to reclaim the only woman he had ever loved, even if it meant spilling blood on Hampstead Heath. The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the Bloomsbury townhouse, casting pale shadows across the faded wallpaper that had once been fashionable when Cordelia's mother was alive. Lady Cordelia Ashworth sat at the small writing desk in what had optimistically been called the morning room, though morning brought little joy to this household anymore. The stack of creditors' demands before her seemed to grow taller each day, each document bearing increasingly urgent language and threats of legal action. At 26, Cordelia had become an expert in the cold mathematics of poverty, calculating how long they could stretch each remaining pound, which bills could be delayed another month, which servants could be dismissed without complete scandal. Her fingers traced the latest missive from Messrs. Hartwell and Sons, the family solicitors, their polite language barely concealing the gravity of their situation. The Ashworth estate in Derbyshire, her childhood paradise of rolling hills and ancient oaks, had been sold 6 months ago to satisfy the most pressing debts. The proceeds had bought them time, nothing more. This London house, inherited from her maternal grandmother and their final refuge, was mortgaged beyond its worth. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. They had perhaps 3 months before complete ruin. She glanced toward the window where her brother Benedict sat in his bath chair, a woolen blanket tucked around his thin legs. At 22, he should have been riding to hounds, dancing at balls, breaking hearts across London. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Instead, the riding accident that had shattered his spine 3 years ago had left him dependent on her care, his brilliant mind trapped in a body that grew weaker each passing season. The finest physicians in London had examined him, their diagnoses uniformly grim. He required constant medical attention, specialized treatments, medicines that cost more than most families spent in a year. Every cough that racked his chest, every fevered night, reminded Cordelia that time was not merely running out for their finances. Benedict turned from the window with a smile that broke her heart in its determined cheerfulness. "Cordelia, you look as though you're planning to sell me to the highest bidder. Shall I polish up my Latin to increase my market value?" She forced herself to return his smile, though it felt like wearing a mask carved from stone. "Your Latin was always superior to mine, dear brother. Perhaps I should be the one for sale." Their shared laughter held an edge of desperation that neither acknowledged. Benedict had inherited their father's wit along with his weak constitution, but unlike their father, he possessed the wisdom to know when levity served as a shield against unbearable truth. The sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs preceded Lady Araminta Fairfax's dramatic entrance into the room like a whirlwind of pale blue silk and barely contained excitement. Cordelia's cousin possessed the kind of vivacious beauty that made rooms seem brighter simply by her presence. Her golden curls always perfectly arranged, her cheeks naturally pink with enthusiasm. She paused in the doorway, slightly breathless, her eyes sparkling with the particular joy that came from bearing momentous news. "Cordelia, Benedict, you must hear what has transpired. Lord Reginald Pemberton has been making inquiries about you, Cordelia. Very particular inquiries through the proper channels." Cordelia set down the creditor's letter with careful precision, her heart beginning a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "What manner of inquiries, Araminta?" Araminta glided into the room, settling herself on the worn sofa with graceful efficiency. She had perfected the art of seeing even their reduced circumstances seem fashionable through the sheer force of her personality. The Earl of Thornfield is a man of considerable wealth and standing, as you well know. His estates in Yorkshire are vast, his holdings diverse. His reputation for kindness legendary among those who know him well. More importantly, Araminta continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, he is lately returned from a year of mourning for his first wife and appears ready to establish a new household. His man of business has been discreetly investigating suitable ladies of good family and impeccable character. Your name, my dear cousin, appears prominently on his list." Benedict shifted in his chair, his intelligent eyes moving between the two women. Thornfield must be what? Past 40 by now. A considerable age difference. Araminta waved this concern away with an airy gesture. 42. But what signifies age when a man possesses such sterling qualities? He is neither a libertine nor a gamester. His first marriage, by all accounts, was exceptionally happy, and his wealth is so vast that financial security would never again trouble this household. She paused, allowing the weight of those last words to settle over the room. Think of it, Cordelia. No more creditors, no more counting every shilling, no more worrying about Benedict's medical expenses. Lord Reginald could provide the finest physicians, the most advanced treatments, perhaps even a chance for improvement in Benedict's condition. Cordelia rose from her chair and moved to the window, her hands gripping the sill as she stared out at the narrow street below. A gentleman rode past on a magnificent bay horse, his bearing confident, his clothing immaculate. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought she recognized the set of those broad shoulders, the particular way he held his head. But it was merely a stranger, and the painful flutter in her chest subsided back into the familiar ache that had been her constant companion for 3 years. She could not speak Lord Reginald's name without remembering another name, could not consider marriage without thinking of the man who had claimed her heart so completely that no other could ever possess it. Nathaniel Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest, had pursued her with the intensity of a man accustomed to having whatever he desired. Their courtship had been conducted largely in secret, stolen moments that felt more real than any public declaration. She remembered the way his grey eyes would find hers across crowded ballrooms, the subtle pressure of his hand when he helped her from carriages, the conversations that stretched into dawn hours when they met by apparent accident in Hyde Park. He had spoken to her of books and philosophy, of his plans to use his vast influence for social reform, of a future where they would work together to help those less fortunate. She had believed every word, had given her heart completely to a man who seemed to see not just her beauty, but her mind, her soul, her deepest convictions. The passion between them had been overwhelming, dangerous in its intensity. That night in the conservatory at Blackwood House, surrounded by exotic blooms and moonlight, he had kissed her with such desperate hunger that she had forgotten every rule of proper behavior. When he whispered against her lips that he loved her beyond reason, that he would speak to her father the very next morning, she had believed they were meant to be together forever. Instead, he had vanished without explanation, leaving only rumors of urgent business on the continent. Her letters had gone unanswered, her inquiries met with polite but firm denials from his staff. Months later, the announcement of his engagement to Lady Vivian Hartwell had appeared in the papers like a blade to her heart. The banker's daughter possessed a dowry rumoured to exceed £50,000, making her the most practical choice for a duke who suddenly seemed to value financial advantage over love. Araminta's voice cut through her painful reverie. "Cordelia, I know what you are thinking, but you must consider reality. The Duke of Ravencrest made his choice 3 years ago, and it was not you. Dwelling on what might have been serves no purpose when your family faces immediate ruin. Lord Reginald offers something far more valuable than romantic fantasy: security, kindness, and the means to save Benedict's life." Benedict spoke quietly from his chair, his voice holding the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Cordelia has sacrificed enough for my sake already. I will not have her marry where her heart cannot follow simply to secure my comfort." His words, meant kindly, only deepened Cordelia's torment. How could she explain that her heart had been buried 3 years ago with Nathaniel's inexplicable betrayal? What remained was duty, responsibility, and love for the brother who needed her care. Marriage to Lord Reginald would not be a sacrifice of love, but a practical arrangement that could benefit them all. She turned from the window to face both Araminta and Benedict, her decision crystallizing with each word she spoke. "Love is a luxury I can no longer afford. Lord Reginald is offering partnership, security, and respect. These are not inconsiderable gifts. If he truly wishes to court me properly, I will receive his addresses." The relief in Araminta's face was matched by the concern in Benedict's. But Cordelia's mind was made up. She had spent 3 years learning to live without the man she loved. Now she would learn to build a life with one she could respect. The shadows lengthened as afternoon gave way to evening, and Cordelia found herself alone in the small library that had once been her father's pride. The shelves, now half empty from the necessity of selling first editions to pay for medicine and coal, still held her most treasured volumes. She pulled down a slim book of sonnets, its leather binding worn smooth by countless readings, and opened to a page marked with oppressed violets. The flower had been picked 3 springs ago in Hyde Park during one of her secret meetings with Nathaniel, a token of a morning when the world had seemed full of infinite possibility. She had pressed it between these pages the night after he disappeared, when hope still flickered that some explanation would come, some word that would make sense of his abandonment. Now the violet was brown and brittle, like her dreams of love. The verses on the page spoke of constancy and devotion, of love that endured beyond time and circumstance. Once, she had believed such sentiments reflected truth rather than mere poetry. Experience had taught her otherwise. Love was not the steady force of nature the poets claimed, but something far more fragile, subject to the whims of circumstance and the cold calculations of social advantage. She closed the book carefully, the pressed violet crumbling slightly at the edges. Tomorrow she would begin the process of learning to care for Lord Reginald Pemberton, Earl of Thornfield. She would study his interests, his habits, his expectations for a wife. She would transform herself into the companion he deserved, grateful for his kindness and determined to bring honor to his name. The girl who had loved the Duke of Ravencrest with passionate intensity would be buried alongside the violet, a relic of youth and foolish romanticism. In her place would rise a woman of practical wisdom, one who understood that security and respect formed a far stronger foundation for marriage than the shifting sands of romantic love. As she prepared for bed that night, Cordelia caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dressing table. At 26, she retained the beauty that had caught Nathaniel's attention, though 3 years of worry and responsibility had added depth to her features, a gravity that spoke of trials endured and lessons learned. She was no longer the hopeful girl who had believed in fairy tales, but a woman who understood the hard realities of life. Lord Reginald would find in her a wife worthy of his position, one who brought dignity and grace to his household, even if she could not bring the passionate love she had once reserved for another. The decision made, she felt a strange peace settle over her spirit. She would marry the Earl of Thornfield and make the best life possible within the bounds of duty and mutual respect. It was more than many women could claim, and far more than her current circumstances would allow if she continued to chase the ghost of a love that had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. Lord Reginald Pemberton arrived at the Ashworth townhouse precisely at 2 o'clock on a crisp Thursday afternoon, his punctuality speaking to the methodical nature that governed all aspects of his life. Cordelia watched from the morning-room window as he descended from his well-appointed carriage, noting the careful attention he paid to his appearance and the respectful manner in which he addressed even the humblest of his servants. At 42, the Earl of Thornfield possessed the kind of steady handsomeness that improved with age, his brown hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples, his bearing upright and confident without arrogance. He was not the sort of man to set hearts racing at first glance, but neither was he one to disappoint upon closer acquaintance. When Mrs. Hartwell, their remaining housekeeper, announced his arrival, Cordelia felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. This interview would determine the course of her entire future, and she was acutely aware that her response must be both honest and practical. Benedict had positioned himself strategically in his bath chair, ready to serve as chaperone, while maintaining the fiction that his presence was merely coincidental. His encouraging smile gave her strength as Lord Reginald entered the room with the measured steps of a man who understood the gravity of his purpose. "My lord?" Cordelia said, rising to offer a curtsy that struck the perfect balance between respect and dignity. "You honor our household with your visit. Please, be seated." Reginald chose the chair opposite her own, his hands resting calmly on his knees as he regarded her with eyes the color of warm brandy. "Lady Cordelia," he began, his voice carrying the slight Yorkshire accent that marked his origins, "I believe we are both sensible people who understand the nature of my call today. I come to you not with flowery speeches or romantic declarations, but with an offer that I hope will prove mutually beneficial to our respective circumstances." His directness surprised her, though she found it refreshing after years of navigating the subtle deceptions that characterized most social interactions. "Indeed, my lord, I appreciate your candor and shall endeavor to match it." Reginald leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but not unkind. "I am seeking a wife who can serve as my companion and partner in managing a large household and extensive social obligations. My first marriage was exceptionally happy, and while I do not expect to recreate that particular bond, I believe a union based on mutual respect and shared goals can provide satisfaction for both parties. I have observed you in society, Lady Cordelia, and admire your intelligence, grace, and the strength you have shown in managing your family's difficulties. You would bring honor to the title of Countess of Thornfield." Benedict cleared his throat softly, reminding them of his presence without intruding upon the conversation. "Lord Reginald, if I may speak plainly, what specific arrangements do you envision for this partnership?" The Earl turned to acknowledge Benedict with the courtesy he would show any gentleman, despite the younger man's obvious physical limitations. "Mr. Benedict, I am glad you raise practical matters. Lady Cordelia would have complete authority over the household management of my 3 principal residences, a generous allowance for personal expenses, and freedom to pursue her charitable interests, which I understand are considerable. More importantly," he continued, returning his attention to Cordelia, "I would immediately arrange for the finest physicians in England to evaluate your brother's condition. I have heard promising reports of treatments being developed in Edinburgh and Vienna that might improve his comfort, if not his mobility. Furthermore, your family's debts would be settled in full, allowing you both to live without the constant anxiety that currently shadows your days." Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected generosity, though she blinked them away before they could fall. "Your offer is more than generous, my lord. But I must ask what you require of me beyond household management and social obligations." Reginald's expression remained steady, but she detected a slight softening around his eyes. "I require loyalty, respect, and honesty in all our dealings. I hope for companionship and perhaps, in time, affection born of mutual regard. I do not demand love, Lady Cordelia, for I understand that such feelings cannot be commanded. But I do expect fidelity, and a genuine effort to build a life together based on shared values and common purpose." As for more intimate matters, he continued with admirable composure, "I believe such things develop naturally between two people who respect one another. I would never force my attentions upon you, but I confess I hope that our marriage might eventually encompass all aspects of partnership between husband and wife." His honesty touched something deep within her, a recognition that this man offered something precious and rare: safety without degradation, security without the loss of dignity. She thought of the creditors' letters upstairs, of Benedict's increasingly frequent coughs, of the empty larder and cold rooms that awaited them if she refused this offer. But more than that, she thought of Lord Reginald himself, who seemed to possess the kind of steady character that would weather any storm. "My lord," she said carefully, "I must be equally honest with you. My heart has been given once before, and though that attachment brought only pain, I cannot promise that I am entirely free from its influence. If you seek a wife who comes to you with no romantic history, you should look elsewhere." Reginald was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Lady Cordelia, I am past 40 and have loved deeply once myself. I would be a fool to expect a woman of your beauty and accomplishments to have reached 26 without forming attachments. What matters to me is that you enter this marriage with honest intentions and a willingness to build something meaningful together. The past is beyond our control, but the future remains ours to shape." Benedict spoke again, his voice gentle but serious. "Lord Reginald, my sister has sacrificed much for my welfare over these past 3 years. I would see her happy, not merely secure. Can you offer her the possibility of contentment, even if not the passionate romance novels would have us believe in?" The Earl rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he considered his response. "Mr. Benedict, I believe happiness comes from many sources: useful work, shared goals, mutual respect, the satisfaction of a life well lived in service to others. I cannot promise your sister the earth and stars, but I can promise her a life of dignity, purpose, and increasing affection. My first wife would tell you, were she able, that some of life's deepest joys come not from grand passion, but from the steady pleasure of partnership with someone who values and understands you." When he turned back to face them, his expression held a warmth that transformed his pleasant features into something approaching handsomeness. "Lady Cordelia, I am asking you to take a considerable leap of faith. In return, I offer you not just my name and fortune, but my commitment to build a marriage worthy of us both. Will you do me the honor of accepting my proposal?" The words seemed to rise from some deep well of practical wisdom within her, surprising her with their firmness. "Yes, my lord, I will marry you." The relief that flooded Reginald's face was immediately followed by genuine pleasure, and when he took her hand to press it gently to his lips, she felt the first stirring of what might eventually become affection. "You have made me very happy, Lady Cordelia. I promise you will never have cause to regret your decision." As they discussed the practical arrangements for their wedding, Cordelia found herself genuinely listening to his plans rather than just enduring them. Lord Reginald spoke of his Yorkshire estates with obvious love, describing the ancient castle that served as his primary seat and the modern improvements he had made for comfort and efficiency. He mentioned his tenants with the kind of personal interest that suggested genuine care for their welfare, and his plans for their honeymoon showed consideration for her preferences rather than mere dictation of his own desires. When he finally took his leave, promising to call again the following day to discuss settlements with Benedict, Cordelia felt something she had not experienced in 3 years: hope for the future. It was not the wild, soaring hope of her youth, but something steadier and more sustainable. Lord Reginald offered her the chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. It was more than she had dared dream possible. 3 weeks before her wedding, Cordelia found herself at Lady Jersey's musicale, enduring the polite congratulations of society matrons who barely concealed their relief that the impoverished Ashworth daughter had managed to secure such an advantageous match. She wore one of her few remaining good gowns, a deep blue silk that brought out her eyes, and had arranged her hair in a style that suggested elegance without ostentation. Lord Reginald stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring as they navigated the social currents of one of the season's most exclusive gatherings. The musical program featured a young soprano whose voice soared through Mozart's most challenging arias, but Cordelia found her attention wandering as she mentally catalogued the faces around them, noting which former friends now treated her with careful courtesy and which had maintained their genuine warmth despite her reduced circumstances. It was during the interval between performances that she felt the familiar prickle of awareness that meant someone was watching her with unusual intensity. She turned toward the source of that sensation and felt her world stop completely. Nathaniel Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest, stood near the far wall of Lady Jersey's drawing room, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. 3 years had only enhanced his natural magnetism, adding maturity to features that had already been striking and lending authority to a bearing that commanded attention in any room. His dark hair showed no touch of silver. His tall frame remained athletic and powerful, and when their eyes met across the crowded room, she felt 17 again, helplessly caught in the pull of his overwhelming presence. Lord Reginald, engrossed in conversation with Lord Castlereagh about agricultural improvements, remained unaware of the drama unfolding beside him. Cordelia struggled to maintain her composure as Nathaniel began moving through the crowd with the kind of purposeful grace that parted groups of people without apparent effort. She could read his intention in every line of his approach, could see the determination in his eyes that had once thrilled her beyond measure. Now it only filled her with a mixture of panic and long-buried longing that threatened to destroy 3 years of carefully constructed defenses. "Your Grace," she managed when he reached them, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "How unexpected to find you returned to London. I trust your travels have been profitable." Nathaniel executed a perfect bow, but his eyes never left her face, drinking in every detail as though memorizing her features anew. "Lady Cordelia," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations. "Indeed, my recent journeys have proven most illuminating, though I confess London holds attractions that no foreign court can match." Lord Reginald, alerted by the changed quality of the air around them, turned to regard the newcomer with polite interest. "Nathaniel, this is my betrothed, Lord Reginald Pemberton, Earl of Thornfield," Cordelia said, grateful that her voice remained steady. "My lord, may I present His Grace the Duke of Ravencrest?" The 2 men exchanged bows with the precise courtesy that masked deeper currents, each taking the measure of the other with the quick assessment that marked experienced men of the world. Reginald's expression remained pleasant but alert, while something dangerous flickered in Nathaniel's eyes as he processed the word betrothed. "Your Grace," Reginald said warmly, "I have heard much of your work in agricultural reform. Perhaps we might find occasion to discuss your innovations in crop rotation when time permits." Nathaniel's smile held edges sharp enough to cut. "Indeed, Lord Thornfield, I find the proper cultivation of what one values most essential to any successful harvest. Some things, however, cannot be improved through mere technique. They require understanding, passion, and the kind of devoted attention that transforms good soil into something extraordinary." The double meaning in his words hung between them like a challenge, and Cordelia felt her cheeks warm despite her determination to remain unmoved by his presence. "Your Grace speaks as one with considerable experience in such matters," she said carefully. "I trust your own estates have benefited from such devoted attention." His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment the crowded room seemed to fade away entirely. "I confess, Lady Cordelia, that I allowed certain valuable properties to lie fallow through neglect and poor judgment. Time abroad has taught me the true cost of such carelessness. A wise man learns to recognize what he should have protected above all else, and fights to reclaim it before the opportunity is lost forever." Lord Reginald's hand moved to rest lightly on Cordelia's arm, a gesture both protective and possessive that was not lost on Nathaniel. "Your Grace appears to believe that some harvests can be reclaimed regardless of the season. I have found that the most successful cultivators understand timing, respect others' claims, and honor the contracts already made." The implicit warning in Reginald's words brought a slight smile to Nathaniel's lips, but his eyes remained fixed on Cordelia with an intensity that made her hands tremble. "Perhaps, my lord, but I have also observed that some agreements are made under duress, when drought conditions make any offer seem attractive. A change in weather might reveal better options than were previously available." The musical program resumed before Cordelia could respond, saving her from the necessity of navigating between these two men who circled each other like opponents in some ancient ritual. As they took their seats for the second half of the performance, she felt Nathaniel's presence behind her like a physical force, his attention burning through the silk of her gown until she could think of nothing but the memory of his hands on her skin, his voice whispering promises he had ultimately failed to keep. When the evening finally ended, Nathaniel approached once more as they prepared to leave. The crowd around them provided little private privacy, but his words carried clearly to her ears alone. "I should have fought harder for what was mine, Lady Cordelia. Some mistakes haunt a man until he finds the courage to correct them." Her response came before she could stop herself, 3 years of pain and confusion sharpening her voice to a blade. "I was never yours, Your Grace. You made that abundantly clear when you disappeared without explanation and married another for her fortune." The stricken look that crossed his features might have moved her once, but she had learned too well the cost of trusting in the sincerity of his expressions. As Lord Reginald escorted her to their carriage, Cordelia forced herself not to look back at the man who had just reappeared to shatter the careful peace she had built from the wreckage of her dreams. The atmosphere at White's Gentlemen's Club on the Tuesday evening before Cordelia's wedding carried an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the usual discussions of politics and profit that characterized such gathering. Benedict Ashworth, present as Lord Reginald's guest for what had been planned as a quiet dinner among gentlemen, found himself witness to a confrontation that would alter the course of several lives within the span of minutes. The dining room buzzed with subdued conversation as London's most influential men discussed the latest news from Vienna, where negotiations continued to reshape Europe in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat. Benedict, despite his physical limitations, had been warmly welcomed into this bastion of masculine privilege through Lord Reginald's sponsorship, and he was genuinely enjoying the intellectual discourse when Nathaniel Blackwood entered the room with the kind of controlled intensity that immediately drew every eye. The Duke of Ravencrest moved through the assembled company with predatory grace, acknowledging acquaintances with perfunctory courtesy, while his attention remained fixed upon Lord Reginald with laser-like focus. Benedict felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the look of a man who had come to settle accounts, regardless of the consequences. The conversations around them gradually stilled as other members sensed the approaching storm, though most remained unaware of its specific nature. "Thornfield," Nathaniel said when he reached their table, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. "A word, if you please." Lord Reginald rose from his chair with the measured dignity that characterized all his movements, but Benedict caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood this was no casual social encounter. "Your Grace, of course. Shall we step into the library where we might speak privately?" Nathaniel's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "I think our conversation might benefit from witnesses, my lord. Some matters require public acknowledgement to carry proper weight." The words sent a chill through Benedict's spine, for he recognized the formal cadence that preceded challenges to honor among men who lived by codes older than law. Lord Reginald remained standing, his bearing calm but alert, as Nathaniel continued with barely leashed fury. "I find myself curious about your recent engagement, Thornfield. Tell me, what does it cost these days to purchase a woman's hand when she has no choice but to accept the first offer that promises to save her family from ruin?" The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol, and Benedict saw several gentlemen at nearby tables rise from their seats as they realized they were witnessing the prelude to something that could not be taken back. Lord Reginald's response came with steel beneath the silk of his cultivated manner. "Your Grace appears to labor under several misapprehensions. Lady Cordelia accepted my proposal freely, after careful consideration of its merits. I offered partnership and respect to a woman I admire greatly, not charity to a desperate supplicant." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a register that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have conveyed. "Partnership, you call it. How noble of you to dress your opportunism in such fine language. Did you perhaps mention to Lady Cordelia that the man she truly loved had recently returned to London, or did you rush her to the altar to prevent any inconvenient reconsideration of her choice?" The accusation brought a flush to Lord Reginald's cheeks, but his voice remained steady. "I mentioned no such thing because Lady Cordelia made no mention of harboring affection for any other gentleman. If your Grace believes himself entitled to her consideration, perhaps the time to press such claims was 3 years ago, before abandoning her without explanation to marry a banker's daughter for her dowry." The reference to his mercenary marriage with Lady Vivian struck home, and Nathaniel's facade of controlled civility finally cracked to reveal the volcanic emotion beneath. "Circumstances forced that choice upon me. Circumstances you could not possibly understand. But those obstacles no longer exist, and I will not stand aside while you profit from my temporary inability to act." Benedict watched in growing horror as the confrontation escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Around them, the most powerful men in England had fallen silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be discussed in drawing rooms and coffee-houses for years to come. Lord Reginald's next words sealed his fate with quiet precision. "Your Grace, if circumstances forced you to abandon Lady Cordelia without explanation, then perhaps those same circumstances reveal something about your character that she deserves to consider. A man who truly loved her would have found a way to fight for her, not disappeared like a coward when difficulties arose." The word coward struck the assembled company like a thunderclap, and Benedict saw Nathaniel's hand move instinctively toward where his sword would hang if they had been meeting anywhere but this civilized sanctuary. The Duke's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of color high on his cheekbones, and when he spoke, his voice carried the formal cadences of ritual challenge. "Lord Thornfield, You have questioned both my character and my courage in the presence of witnesses. I believe satisfaction is required." Benedict found his voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Gentlemen, surely this misunderstanding can be resolved without resort to such extreme measures." Both men turned toward him with expressions that suggested they had momentarily forgotten his presence, and the pity in their eyes confirmed his worst fears. This was no misunderstanding, but the inevitable collision of forces that had been building toward this moment since Nathaniel's return to London. Nathaniel straightened to his full height, every inch the arrogant peer who had never known defeat in any arena. "Lord Thornfield, I challenge you to meet me with pistols 3 days hence at dawn. The terms are simple. The winner, should both survive, earns the right to claim Lady Cordelia's hand in marriage. She shall choose between us, knowing that honour has been satisfied and the better man proven." Lord Reginald stood silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications of accepting such a challenge. To refuse would brand him a coward before London's most influential men, destroying both his reputation and any possibility of happiness with Cordelia. To accept meant risking everything on his skill with weapons he had not used seriously since his youth. But there was really no choice at all, and every man in the room understood that fact. "Your Grace," he said finally, "I accept your challenge. Pistols at dawn, 3 days hence. Let us hope that when this matter is concluded, the lady in question will forgive us both for settling her future through such primitive means." The formalities of arranging the duel proceeded with grim efficiency. Seconds appointed, terms agreed upon, location selected for Hampstead Heath, where such affairs could be conducted with minimal risk of interference. As the details were finalized, Benedict realized with sick certainty that his sister's wedding would proceed as planned, but the morning after might see her either a widow or the prize in a contest between two men whose pride had overcome their reason. The greatest tragedy was that Cordelia remained unaware of the storm gathering around her, preparing for a marriage that might last only hours before being dissolved by powder and shot on a misty heath outside London. The conservatory at Blackwood House had become a shrine to memories that Cordelia both cherished and despised. Its exotic blooms and humid air still carrying the phantom scent of jasmine from that night 3 years ago when Nathaniel had claimed her heart with such devastating thoroughness. She had not intended to accept Lady Millicent's urgent invitation to tea, but something in the younger woman's desperate note had compelled her to venture into the very place where her dreams had been born and subsequently murdered by cruel reality. Lady Millicent Blackwood possessed the same striking grey eyes as her brother, though hers held a warmth and accessibility that his often lacked, and at 23 she had developed into the kind of beauty that turned heads at every gathering. Today, however, her usual vivacity was replaced by an agitation so pronounced that her hands trembled as she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups painted with tiny roses. The silence stretched between them as Cordelia waited for an explanation of this peculiar meeting, her own nerves stretched taut by the proximity to memories she had worked so hard to bury. "Lady Cordelia," Millicent began at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must beg your forgiveness for what I am about to reveal. For 3 years I have watched my brother destroy himself with guilt and regret, believing himself bound by honor to remain silent about circumstances that were never truly his fault. But your upcoming marriage to Lord Thornfield, however advantageous it may appear, has driven him to desperate measures that could result in his death or disgrace. I cannot remain silent when the truth might prevent such tragedy." Cordelia set down her teacup with careful precision, her heart beginning the familiar rapid rhythm that accompanied any mention of Nathaniel's name. "Lady Millicent, whatever occurred between your brother and myself belongs to the past. I have accepted Lord Thornfield's proposal with clear understanding of the practical advantages it offers both our families. Personal feelings must sometimes be set aside in favor of duty and responsibility." Millicent leaned forward urgently, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But that is precisely the point, my dear Lady Cordelia. Both you and Nathaniel have sacrificed your happiness based on misconceptions about duty and honor that need never have existed. If you knew the true circumstances of his departure 3 years ago, if you understood the impossible choices he faced, and the agony of his silence, you might view your current situation quite differently." The words stirred something dangerous within Cordelia's chest, a flicker of the hope she had ruthlessly suppressed for 3 long years. She forced herself to speak calmly despite the chaos in her heart. "Your brother made his choice when he married Lady Vivian Hartwell for her substantial dowry. Whatever circumstances prompted that decision, they cannot change the fact that he chose financial advantage over whatever attachment he may have felt for me." Millicent's laugh held no humor, only bitter irony. "Attachment, you call it? Lady Cordelia, my brother was so deeply in love with you that your loss nearly destroyed his reason entirely. The night he disappeared from London, he had already spoken to our family solicitors about settlements, had commissioned a ring from the finest jeweller in Bond Street, had planned to call upon your father the very next morning to request your hand. Instead, he received word that our father lay dying, and the entire dukedom faced financial ruin that would have left hundreds of families homeless and destitute." The revelation struck Cordelia like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain composed, even as her carefully constructed understanding of the past began to crumble. "Your father's illness explains his departure, but not his subsequent marriage or his years of silence. Surely, if his feelings were as strong as you claim, he might have found some way to communicate his circumstances." Millicent rose from her chair and began pacing the length of the conservatory, her agitation evident in every movement. "You do not understand the magnitude of the crisis he faced, Lady Cordelia. Our father's steward had been systematically embezzling funds for nearly a decade, using forged documents to obtain loans against the estate that had never been properly secured. When Papa suffered his apoplectic fit, the creditors descended like vultures, demanding immediate payment of sums that exceeded the estate's apparent worth by tens of thousands of pounds. Nathaniel arrived to find tenant farmers who had not received promised improvements to their cottages, estate workers whose wages were months in arrears, and families facing eviction because the money collected for their rent had disappeared into the steward's private accounts. The young woman paused beside a bank of white orchids, her fingers touching their delicate petals as she continued her painful recitation. For 2 years, Nathaniel worked without rest to save the estate and protect those who depended upon it. He sold every personal possession of value, liquidated investments that had been in the family for generations, and borrowed against his own expectations to meet the most pressing obligations. But it was not enough, Lady Cordelia. The debts were simply too vast, and the creditors too numerous and impatient. Cordelia found herself leaning forward, despite her determination to remain unmoved, drawn into the story despite her better judgment. And Lady Vivian Hartwell's dowry provided the necessary funds to satisfy these obligations. Precisely, but you must understand that the marriage was conducted as a business transaction rather than a romantic union. Lady Vivian herself proposed the arrangement through intermediaries, seeking the prestige of becoming a duchess while knowing that affection would play no role in their relationship. Nathaniel agreed because her £50,000 would save not only the estate, but the lives and livelihoods of everyone who depended upon it. The ceremony was conducted privately, without celebration or joy, and they lived essentially separate lives throughout their brief marriage. When Lady Vivian died in childbirth after only 8 months, Nathaniel mourned her death as he would any decent woman's, but their union had been one of mutual convenience rather than love. The silence that followed this revelation stretched uncomfortably as Cordelia struggled to process information that recast everything she thought she understood about Nathaniel's choices. If what Millicent claimed was true, then his silence stemmed not from indifference, but from the same misplaced nobility that now drove her own decision to marry Lord Thornfield. But why did he never write to explain these circumstances? She asked finally. Surely I deserved some word, some explanation that might have eased the pain of his disappearance. Millicent returned to her chair, her expression infinitely sad. Because, my dear Lady Cordelia, he could not bear to ask the woman he loved to share his ruined circumstance. Nor could he explain his mercenary marriage to another without seeming to make excuses for what he saw as his own failure to protect you from hardship. By the time the estate was financially stable again, your father had died, and Nathaniel learned of your family's own struggles. His pride prevented him from approaching you then, convinced that you would see his renewed interest as pity for your reduced circumstances, rather than the persistent love that had never diminished despite time and separation. The irony was so bitter that Cordelia nearly laughed at its cruel perfection. Both she and Nathaniel had suffered needlessly for 3 years, each sacrificing personal happiness in what they believed was the other's best interest, each too proud to reveal their continued devotion for fear it would seem like weakness or opportunism. The knowledge that he had loved her truly, had planned to marry her before circumstances intervened so dramatically, threatened to destroy every rational decision she had made about her future with Lord Thornfield. Lady Millicent, she said carefully, even if what you say is true, it cannot change my current circumstances. I have accepted Lord Thornfield's proposal in good faith, and he has already begun arrangements to settle my family's debts and provide for my brother's medical care. I cannot break such an engagement without cause, nor can I expect Lord Thornfield to release me simply because another gentleman has returned to London with explanations for past behaviour. Millicent's eyes filled with desperate tears as she grasped Cordelia's hands between her own. But surely you must see that your engagement was formed under false assumptions about Nathaniel's character and intentions. If you had known the truth about his departure, would you have accepted Lord Thornfield's proposal so readily? And now that you do know, can you honestly proceed with a marriage that condemns you both to lives of duty without love when true happiness remains possible? The question hung between them like a sword suspended by the finest thread, and Cordelia felt her carefully constructed resolve beginning to fracture under the weight of possibilities she had never dared consider. The knowledge that Nathaniel had loved her as completely as she had loved him, that his silence stemmed from noble sacrifice rather than callous indifference, changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Her duty to Lord Thornfield remained unchanged, her brother's needs were no less pressing, and the practical advantages of the marriage she had agreed to were no less real simply because her heart had been given years ago to another man. The weight of Millicent's revelations pressed upon Cordelia's chest like a physical burden as she walked slowly through the streets of Bloomsbury, her mind churning with implications that threatened to destroy every careful calculation she had made about her future. The afternoon had grown overcast, matching her internal turmoil with grey skies that promised rain before evening fell. She found herself taking the longest possible route home, desperate to postpone the moment when she would have to face Benedict's knowing eyes and pretend that her world had not shifted fundamentally in the space of an hour. By the time she reached their modest townhouse, darkness was gathering in the corners of the sky, and her brother was already positioned in his usual spot by the morning-room window, a book forgotten in his lap as he watched for her return. The concern in his expression told her immediately that her inner turmoil was more visible than she had hoped, and she felt her already fragile composure threaten to crumble entirely under his gentle scrutiny. "You look as though you have seen a ghost, dear sister," Benedict observed as she settled into the chair opposite him. "Was Lady Millicent's tea party so very taxing?" Cordelia attempted a smile that felt more like a grimace, her hands fidgeting with her gloves as she struggled to find words that might explain the upheaval in her heart without revealing the full scope of her distress. She merely wished to reminisce about old times, Cordelia said finally, but her voice carried a hollow note that fooled neither of them. Benedict was far too intelligent and had observed her too closely over the years to be deceived by such transparent evasion. "Old times involving her brother, perhaps," Benedict suggested quietly. "Cordelia, you cannot hope to hide your feelings from someone who has watched you struggle with them for 3 years. If the Duke of Ravencrest has returned to London with explanations for his past behavior, you deserve to know whether those explanations change anything about your current situation." The tears she had been fighting since leaving Blackwood House finally spilled over Xiam, and she found herself sobbing with the helpless abandon of someone whose carefully maintained defenses had finally crumbled beyond repair. Benedict moved his bath chair closer to her seat, taking her hands in his with the gentle strength that had always been his greatest gift, and waited patiently while she wept for dreams that had seemed safely buried until this afternoon. When her tears finally subsided, she told him everything Millicent had revealed, watching his expression shift from sympathy to understanding, to a deep sadness that seemed to encompass not just her pain, but some larger tragedy she could not identify. "So he loved you truly," Benedict said when she had finished her recitation. "And you love him still, despite 3 years of trying to convince yourself otherwise." The simple statement held such devastating accuracy that she could only nod, fresh tears threatening to overwhelm her again. "But what difference does it make now, Benedict? I have accepted Lord Thornfield's proposal. The arrangements are made, the settlements agreed upon. I cannot break an engagement without cause simply because my first love has returned with explanations that paint his past actions in a more favorable light." Benedict was quiet for a long moment, his intelligent eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for his diminished frame. "Cordelia, there is something I must tell you. Something I have kept hidden because I hoped against hope that it might not prove necessary. But if you are to make this decision with full knowledge of the consequences, you must understand all the factors involved." Her heart clenched with sudden dread, for she had learned to recognize the particular tone he used when delivering news that would change everything. "Benedict, whatever it is, please tell me directly. I cannot bear any more revelations delivered in careful stages." He took a deep breath, and she saw him gathering the courage that had sustained him through years of physical limitation at Bamsnatsairn and increasing frailty. "The physicians I consulted in Edinburgh last month were more forthcoming than those here in London, perhaps because they have no social connection to our family, and therefore no reason to soften their diagnoses. My condition is deteriorating more rapidly than we have acknowledged, Cordelia. They estimate that I have perhaps a year remaining, possibly less if the consumption spreads as they expect it will." The words struck her like physical blows, each one destroying another piece of the future she had so carefully planned. "But surely there are treatments, specialists who might offer different opinions, new therapies that could improve your prognosis." Benedict shook his head with gentle finality. "I have consulted the finest medical minds in Britain and several on the continent. The diagnosis is unanimous, and I have accepted it with as much grace as I can manage. What troubles me now is not my own fate, which has been apparent for some time, but the knowledge that you are sacrificing your happiness to secure a future I will not live to enjoy." His confession reframed every assumption she had made about her duty and responsibility, stripping away the practical justifications that had made her engagement to Lord Thornfield seem not just reasonable but necessary. If Benedict would not live to benefit from Lord Thornfield's generosity, if the security she sought to provide would prove meaningless within months, then what purpose did her sacrifice serve except to ensure that two people who loved each other would live their remaining time in misery? "But the debts remain," she said desperately, grasping for some thread of logic that might guide her through this maze of impossible choices. "Lord Thornfield's settlement will at least ensure that you live your final months in comfort, with the finest physicians and whatever palliative care might ease your suffering." Benedict smiled with infinite tenderness, and she realized that he had already moved far beyond such practical considerations in his thinking. "Cordelia, my greatest wish is not to die in luxury, but to see you truly happy before I go. If Lord Thornfield can provide the security you need without requiring the sacrifice of your heart's deepest desires, then by all means proceed with the marriage. But if there exists any possibility that you and the Duke of Ravencrest might find your way back to each other, I beg you not to let false duty to me prevent you from seizing that chance." The conversation continued deep into the evening, with brother and sister weighing possibilities and consequences while the candles burned low around them. By midnight, when Benedict finally retired to his room with the assistance of their remaining manservant, Cordelia had reached a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would not break her engagement to Lord Thornfield, for she had given her word, and he deserved better than to be abandoned for reasons beyond his control. But neither would she allow the duel between him and Nathaniel to proceed, for she could not bear the thought that either man might die for the privilege of claiming her hand. Tomorrow morning she would find some way to prevent this masculine ritual of honor from destroying the futures of three people who had already suffered enough from the cruel ironies of fate and timing. The night hours stretched endlessly as she lay wakeful in her bed, planning approaches and discarding them, searching for some solution that might preserve everyone's dignity while preventing irreversible tragedy. By dawn, she had conceived a plan so audacious that it might either save them all or destroy her reputation beyond any hope of recovery. The choice was no longer between duty and love, but between the safety of conventional behavior and the courage to seize control of her own destiny before time and circumstance conspired to steal it forever. The morning of her wedding dawned with the peculiar clarity that sometimes accompanies life's most momentous occasions, as if nature itself conspired to etch every detail into memory with crystalline precision. Cordelia stood before her dressing mirror in the pale light filtering through her bedroom windows, watching as Araminta's capable hands arranged the ivory silk and Brussels lace that would transform her from Miss Cordelia Fairfax into Lady Thornfield within a matter of hours. The gown had belonged to her grandmother, altered carefully to accommodate Cordelia's slighter frame, and the pearl necklace that adorned her throat carried the weight of 3 generations of Fairfax brides who had worn it to their own ceremonies. Yet despite the beauty of her appearance and the solemnity of the approaching ritual, she felt strangely detached from the proceedings, as though she observed them from a great distance rather than standing at their center. The past week had passed in a blur of final preparations and social obligations, each day bringing her closer to a future that felt increasingly surreal despite its practical advantages. Lord Thornfield had proved himself a considerate and attentive bridegroom, sending flowers daily and calling each afternoon to inquire about her comfort and well-being, but his very kindness only intensified her guilt about the deception she was perpetrating upon him. She had not seen Nathaniel since that devastating encounter in the park, though Millicent had sent word that he remained in London and had made no move to interfere with the wedding preparations, a restraint that somehow felt more ominous than any dramatic gesture might have done. Benedict had grown visibly weaker over the past days, the excitement and stress of the approaching ceremony clearly taxing his already fragile constitution. But he had insisted on fulfilling his role as her escort with a determination that both touched and worried her. This morning he sat in the drawing-room below, dressed in his finest coat and waiting with the stoic patience that had characterized his approach to every challenge life had presented, though she could see in his eyes the same mixture of hope and resignation that had haunted her own reflection for weeks. The carriage ride to St. George's, Hanover Square, passed in contemplative silence, broken only by Benedict's occasional murmured reassurances and the rhythmic sound of wheels over cobblestones that seemed to count down the remaining moments of her single life with inexorable precision. The church appeared before them like something from a fairy tale, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun and its doors flanked by arrangements of white roses and trailing ivy that transformed the austere building into a vision of romantic perfection. As their carriage drew to a halt, Cordelia could see the crowd of elegantly dressed guests streaming through the entrance, the cream of London society gathering to witness the union of Lord Thornfield and his carefully chosen bride, though none of them could suspect the complexity of emotions and circumstances that had brought this moment into being. The interior of St. George's seemed to glow with golden light from hundreds of candles that supplemented the natural illumination filtering through stained glass windows, creating an atmosphere of sacred beauty that made her feel simultaneously blessed and guilty for the deception she was about to perpetrate before God and witnesses. Benedict's arm trembled slightly as he escorted her down the aisle, but his steps remained firm and his bearing proud as he prepared to give her away to another man, though she could feel the cost of this effort in the way his breathing had become labored and his grip on her arm had tightened for support rather than guidance. The assembled guests rose as she passed, their faces a blur of polite smiles and curious glances, but her own gaze swept the crowd with desperate intensity until it found the one face that mattered most to her wounded heart. Nathaniel stood in the very back of the church, partially concealed behind a pillar, as though he hoped to observe without being observed, his expression so carefully controlled that it revealed nothing of the emotions that must be warring within him as he watched the woman he loved walk toward marriage with another man. Their eyes met for one devastating moment across the length of the church, and she saw in his grey gaze a pain so profound that it matched her own, though neither could acknowledge it in this most public of settings, without destroying the careful facade they had both maintained for weeks. Lord Thornfield waited at the altar with obvious pleasure and anticipation, his handsome features arranged in an expression of genuine warmth that made her guilt feel like a physical weight pressing upon her chest, for he deserved so much better than a bride whose heart belonged irrevocably to another man, despite her determination to be a faithful and dutiful wife to him. The rector began the ancient ceremony with the traditional words that had bound countless couples in matrimony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church as he spoke of the sacred nature of marriage and the duties and privileges that would unite Lord and Lady Thornfield in the eyes of God and society. When the moment came for vows, Reginald spoke his promises with a sincerity that brought tears to her eyes, pledging to love and cherish her with such evident conviction that she felt her heart break a little more for the love she could not return in equal measure. Her own responses came automatically, the familiar words flowing from her lips with quiet dignity, even as her soul cried out in protest against the binding nature of promises made without the full engagement of her heart, though she forced herself to speak clearly and firmly for the benefit of the man who deserved at least the appearance of willing compliance from his chosen bride. The moment when the rector pronounced them husband and wife seemed to stretch endlessly, time suspended between her old identity and her new one, between the dreams she had cherished and the reality she had chosen, between the past that called to her so insistently and the future she must now embrace with whatever grace she could muster. As Reginald lifted her veil to claim the traditional kiss that sealed their union, she caught one final glimpse of Nathaniel turning away from the scene with an abruptness that suggested his self-control had finally reached its limits, and she knew that he would not remain to witness the recessional or the celebration that would follow. Choosing instead to absent himself from a joy he could not share, and a ceremony that marked the definitive end of whatever hopes he might have harbored for their reunion. The wedding breakfast at Thornfield House unfolded with all the elegance and attention to detail that characterized Reginald's approach to every aspect of his life, from the elaborate floral arrangements that adorned every surface to the carefully selected menu that featured delicacies from across Europe. Though Cordelia found herself barely able to taste the exquisite food or appreciate the beauty of her surroundings through the haze of conflicted emotions that clouded her perception. She played her role as the radiant bride with skill born of years of social training, accepting congratulations with gracious smiles and engaging in the light conversation expected of her. But those who knew her most intimately could detect the shadows that lurked behind her carefully maintained facade. Benedict, seated at her right hand despite his obvious fatigue, watched her with the protective concern that had characterized his behavior throughout their lives, occasionally offering quiet comments or gentle touches that provided anchors of genuine affection in a sea of social performance. Araminta, resplendent in rose silk and obviously delighted by her friend's apparent good fortune, nevertheless caught Cordelia's eye repeatedly with glances that suggested she sensed undercurrents beyond the surface happiness that everyone else seemed to accept without question. Reginald himself proved an exemplary bridegroom, attending to her comfort with thoughtful gestures and including her in conversations with a respect that demonstrated his genuine desire to make their marriage a partnership rather than a mere acquisition, though his very consideration only intensified her awareness of the deception she was practicing upon him with every smile and gracious response. The afternoon stretched endlessly as guest after guest offered their felicitations and shared anecdotes about successful marriages in their own families, each well-meaning comment serving as a reminder of the expectations and hopes that now surrounded her union with Reginald. Expectations that she felt increasingly inadequate to fulfill, given the divided nature of her loyalties and affections. As evening approached and the last guests finally departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the elegant drawing room that would now be her primary domain, Cordelia felt the full weight of her new circumstances settling upon her like a mantle that was both protective and suffocating in its implications for her future happiness and freedom. The cold grey dawn that broke over Hampstead Heath seemed to carry with it all the ominous portents that folklore attributed to mornings when men gathered to settle matters of honour with steel and powder, though the mist that clung to the grass and shrouded the ancient trees in ghostly veils might equally have been nature's attempt to conceal the folly of the proceedings from more sensible eyes. Nathaniel arrived at the appointed place precisely at 6 o'clock, his carriage wheels crunching over the frost-hardened ground as he descended with the grim purposefulness of a man who had spent the night in contemplation of mortality and found himself undaunted by its proximity. His second, Lord Jasper Whitmore, had attempted throughout the journey from Mayfair to dissuade him from this course of action, pointing out with increasing urgency that no good could come from a duel fought over a woman now legally wed to another man. But Nathaniel had remained unmoved by appeals to reason or friendship, driven by forces that went far deeper than wounded pride or conventional notions of honor. The clearing they had chosen for their meeting lay hidden from the main pathways that crossed the heath, surrounded by oak trees whose bare branches created a natural amphitheater for the drama about to unfold. while the morning mist provided additional concealment from any early riders or walkers who might stumble upon their illegal gathering and feel compelled to report it to the authorities. Reginald's carriage appeared through the mist shortly after Nathaniel's arrival, and to everyone's surprise, Benedict emerged alongside the bridegroom, his frail form wrapped in a heavy greatcoat that emphasized rather than concealed his physical deterioration, though his bearing carried the same quiet dignity that had characterized his approach to every challenge throughout his abbreviated life. The presence of Cordelia's brother introduced an element that none of the other participants had anticipated, for while dueling protocol typically required seconds rather than family members, Benedict's obvious terminal condition and his relationship to the woman at the center of their dispute created a moral complexity that rendered normal procedures inadequate to the circumstances. Reginald appeared composed but thoughtful as he greeted his opponents with the courtesy required by the peculiar etiquette governing such encounters, his manner suggesting a man who had spent considerable time weighing the implications of his actions, and found them both necessary and regrettable in equal measure. The formalities proceeded with the grim precision that tradition demanded, from the examination of the pistols to the measurement of the prescribed distance to the final review of the rules that would govern their conduct, each ritual step bringing them closer to a moment that might leave one or both of them dead on the frost-covered grass for the sake of a woman who belonged legally to one and emotionally to the other. Benedict's voice cut through these preparations with unexpected authority as he stepped forward to address both principals, his words carrying the weight of a man who had lived with the constant awareness of mortality and therefore possessed insights that healthy men might lack. "Gentlemen," he began, his breath visible in the cold air as he struggled to project sufficient volume to command their attention. "I have come here not to serve as second or witness, but to make one final appeal to whatever wisdom and compassion may still influence your actions in this matter." The revelation of his terminal condition, delivered with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized his approach to all aspects of his illness, struck both duelists with unexpected force, for while they had known of his consumption, neither had realized how far the disease had progressed or how limited his remaining time had become. "I will not see the year's end," Benedict continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm despite his physical limitations. "And my greatest concern is not my own fate, which has long been settled, but the future happiness of my sister, who has already sacrificed far too much in service of duty and family obligation. You stand here prepared to risk your lives for the privilege of claiming a woman who has given her legal consent to one, while her heart belongs irrevocably to the other. And I submit that neither of you will find satisfaction in a victory achieved through violence rather than through the genuine affection that should be the only foundation for lasting happiness." The appeal struck Reginald with particular force, for his essentially decent nature rebelled against the idea of winning a wife through bloodshed when her feelings had never been truly engaged, and he found himself wavering in his determination to proceed with an encounter that might deprive Cordelia of both husband and former lover in a single morning. "Lord Ravencrest," Reginald said slowly, his pistol lowering slightly as he spoke, "perhaps we might reconsider the necessity of this meeting. Lady Thornfield has made her choice, however reluctantly, and both honor and happiness might be better served by accepting that choice rather than challenging it with weapons that could leave her widowed or bereft of the man she truly loves." The moment hung suspended between them like a soap bubble that might be preserved or destroyed by the slightest movement, hope and reason balanced against pride and passion in a contest whose outcome would determine not only their own fates, but the future happiness of the woman they both claimed to love. But Nathaniel, perhaps driven by 3 years of suppressed emotion and self-recrimination, perhaps unable to bear the thought of a lifetime spent knowing that his silence had cost him the only woman he had ever truly loved, raised his own weapon with renewed determination. "Lord Thornfield," he replied, his voice carrying a finality that chilled the morning air, "your magnanimity does you credit, but some wounds can only be healed by the decisive action of honourable men. Lady Thornfield may indeed be lost to me forever, but I cannot live knowing that I failed to fight for her when the opportunity presented itself, regardless of the consequences that choice may bring." The die had been cast with those words, and Benedict's anguished protest could not recall them, though he continued to plead with both men even as they took their positions at the prescribed distance, their seconds checking the priming of the pistols one final time before stepping back to allow the ancient ritual of honor to proceed to its potentially fatal conclusion. The morning of her wedding dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the turmoil in Cordelia's heart as she stood before her dressing-table mirror, watching her lady's maid arrange the pearl-encrusted veil that had adorned 3 generations of women in her family. The ivory silk gown, cut in the latest fashion with its fitted bodice and flowing skirt, transformed her into the very picture of bridal elegance. But she felt like an actress preparing for a role she had never auditioned for and certainly never wanted to play. Her grandmother's pearls, a wedding gift from Benedict that had cost him the sale of their father's last valuable books, lay cool against her throat like drops of frozen tears, their lustrous surface reflecting the pale morning light that filtered through the windows of her modest chamber. Araminta bustled about the room with forced cheerfulness, chattering about the weather and the flowers and the distinguished guest list, while carefully avoiding any mention of the one name that haunted every corner of Cordelia's thoughts. The ride to St. George's Church in Hanover Square passed in a blur of London streets and curious faces pressed against windows, the hired carriage rolling through the fashionable district where Cordelia had once imagined herself living as Nathaniel's Duchess rather than arriving as another man's reluctant bride. Benedict sat beside her, resplendent in his finest mourning coat, despite the obvious effort it cost him to maintain his dignity, while his body betrayed him with tremors and labored breathing that no amount of determination could entirely disguise. "My dear sister," he said quietly as they turned into Hanover Square, "it is not too late to change your mind if your heart truly rebels against this course. Lord Thornfield is a gentleman who would understand if you found yourself unable to proceed with a marriage that brings you no joy." Cordelia squeezed his gloved hand gently, drawing strength from his familiar presence, even as her resolve wavered at the sight of the church steps crowded with fashionable society, eager to witness what many considered the wedding of the season. "I have given my word, Benedict, and Lord Thornfield has arranged his entire future around our union. Whatever my personal feelings, I cannot disappoint a good man who has shown me nothing but kindness and consideration." The interior of St. George's had been transformed with banks of white roses and trailing ivy, creating an atmosphere of fairy tale romance that felt almost cruel in its perfection as Cordelia walked slowly down the aisle on Benedict's trembling arm, her eyes automatically scanning the assembled guests, despite her determination to focus only on the altar ahead. Lord Thornfield waited with obvious pleasure and genuine affection, his handsome face lighting with such sincere happiness at her approach that her guilt threatened to overwhelm her completely. The Dowager Countess of Pembridge nodded approvingly from the front pew, while various members of the ton whispered behind their fans about the advantageous match and Cordelia's good fortune in securing such an eligible husband after her family's reduced circumstance. But it was the solitary figure standing in the shadows at the very back of the church that stole her breath and nearly caused her to stumble on the ancient stones, for Nathaniel had come to witness the ceremony that would forever place her beyond his reach. His face was a mask of controlled anguish, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to burn through the layers of silk and propriety that separated them, and she felt her carefully constructed composure threaten to shatter under the weight of his regard. The ceremony proceeded with all the ancient solemnity that tradition demanded, the rector's voice echoing through the vaulted space as he spoke of love and honor and the sacred bonds that marriage creates between two souls. Reginald spoke his vows with genuine warmth and obvious sincerity, his voice steady and sure as he promised to love and protect her for all the days of his life, while Cordelia responded with quiet dignity that masked the chaos in her heart. When the moment came to exchange rings, his hands were gentle but firm as he slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger, sealing their union with a symbol that felt more like a shackle than a pledge of devotion. "Do you, Cordelia Margaret Fairfax, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" the rector intoned, and she heard herself responding with the required words, even as her soul cried out in silent rebellion. "I do," she whispered, the words falling like stones into the expectant silence. And when she dared to glance toward the back of the church, Nathaniel's place was empty, the heavy doors still swaying slightly from his abrupt departure. "By the authority vested in me by God and the Church of England, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the rector declared with satisfaction, and as Reginald lifted her veil to claim the traditional kiss, Cordelia closed her eyes and tried to imagine that this moment marked the beginning of contentment rather than the burial of dreams that had sustained her through 3 years of heartbreak and uncertainty. The wedding breakfast at Thornfield House unfolded with the kind of elegant precision that money and good taste could create. The drawing rooms filled with flowers and conversation, while uniformed servants circulated with champagne and delicate refreshments that few of the guests seemed particularly interested in consuming. Cordelia played her role with the skill born of years in society, accepting congratulations and good wishes with appropriate grace, while internally counting the minutes until she could retreat to the privacy of her new chambers and finally allow herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. Lord Thornfield, now her husband in the eyes of God and the law, proved an attentive and considerate companion, introducing her to his various relations and friends with obvious pride, while being careful not to overwhelm her with too much attention during what he surely recognized as a difficult transition. His elderly aunt, Lady Pemberton, embraced Cordelia warmly and whispered that she had prayed for years that her dear nephew would find a woman worthy of his devotion, while his younger cousin expressed delight at finally having a sister to spoil with feminine companionship. Benedict, settled in a comfortable chair near the windows, received a steady stream of visitors who inquired politely about his health while carefully avoiding any direct reference to his obvious decline, and Cordelia felt a stab of gratitude toward these people who showed such delicate consideration for her brother's dignity. Araminta circulated through the crowd like a tiny general, ensuring that everything proceeded smoothly while keeping a watchful eye on both Cordelia and Benedict, ready to intervene if either showed signs of being overwhelmed by the day's emotional demands. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to take their leave, Cordelia found herself genuinely touched by the warmth and acceptance shown by Reginald's family and friends, which only intensified her guilt about the deception she was perpetrating and the knowledge of what tomorrow's dawn would bring. "You have made me the happiest of men, Cordelia," Reginald said quietly, as they stood together in the entrance hall bidding farewell to the last of their guests. "I know that our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I hope that in time you might find it possible to regard me with something approaching the affection I already feel for you." His words were spoken with such gentle sincerity that she felt tears threaten to spill over, and she managed only a tremulous smile in response before excusing herself to check on Benedict, who had retired to his room as soon as politeness permitted. Dawn broke cold and grey over Hampstead Heath, the kind of cheerless morning that seemed designed by Providence to witness affairs of honour and bloodshed, with a bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest coats, and a sky the colour of old pewter that promised neither sun nor mercy for the proceedings about to unfold. Nathaniel arrived precisely at the appointed hour with his second, Lord Jasper Whitmore, a childhood friend whose loyalty had survived years of separation and whose steady presence provided the only comfort available in these grim circumstances. The two men stood apart from the others, their breath visible in small clouds as they spoke in low voices about matters of procedure and protocol, while Nathaniel's face remained a mask of controlled determination that revealed nothing of the torment he had endured through the sleepless hours since witnessing Cordelia's marriage to another. Reginald appeared shortly after, accompanied by Benedict, despite Cordelia's tearful protests the night before, his reasoning being that her brother's presence might serve as a voice of sanity that could prevent the duel from reaching its inevitable and potentially fatal conclusion. The newly married man looked pale but resolute, his jaw set with the kind of quiet courage that characterized his entire approach to this unwelcome but unavoidable situation, while Benedict's presence in his wheeled chair served as a stark reminder of mortality that cast an additional shadow over the already sombre gathering. The surgeon, Dr. Whitman, had arrived early to prepare his instruments and examine the ground for the best position to treat whatever injuries might result from the encounter, his grim efficiency speaking to years of experience with such affairs and their frequently tragic outcomes. The formalities were observed with the kind of grim precision that tradition demanded, seconds consulting their watches and measuring the distance, while the principals examined the matched pistols with the careful attention that such weapons deserved when lives hung in the balance. 20 paces, gentlemen, Lord Whitmore announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. You will walk to your marks, turn on my command, and fire when ready. There will be no second shots unless honour remains unsatisfied, though I pray we shall not reach such extremes. As the two men took their positions, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment, Benedict summoned the strength to attempt one final intervention that might prevent the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable, despite all attempts at reason and diplomacy. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice thin but clear in the morning stillness, "I beg you to consider what you are about to do. Lord Thornfield, you have already won the prize that sparked this quarrel by marrying my sister with all due ceremony and blessing. Duke, your grievance, however justified by past circumstances, cannot be settled by bloodshed without dishonouring the very woman you claim to love." His words carried the weight of approaching death, lending them an authority that might have swayed lesser men. And for a moment it seemed as though reason might prevail over the demands of honour and wounded pride. "My lord," Reginald said slowly, his voice thoughtful as he considered Benedict's appeal, "perhaps we might find some other resolution to our differences. I have no particular desire to kill a man whose only crime was loving my wife before she became my wife, nor do I wish to die for the sake of pride when forgiveness might serve us all better." The words hung in the cold air like an offered hand, and those watching held their breath as they waited to see whether Nathaniel would accept this graceful opportunity to step back from the brink without loss of honour or dignity. But something in the Duke's face had hardened beyond the reach of reason or appeal, perhaps driven by 3 years of suppressed emotion and self-recrimination that had finally found an outlet in this formal ritual of violence and redemption. "Lord Thornfield," Nathaniel replied with icy formality, "your magnanimity does you credit, but I cannot accept a resolution that leaves my honour in question, or suggests that my feelings for Lady Cordelia were somehow improper or unjustified. This matter will be settled according to the code, with steel and powder rather than words and compromise. The die was cast with those words, and even Benedict's final desperate plea fell on ears deafened by pride and pain too long suppressed to be easily turned aside by mere reason or consideration for consequences. Lord Whitmore and the other second exchanged glances that spoke of resignation and regret. But the machinery of honour had been set in motion, and could not be stopped by anything short of divine intervention. The two men walked to their marks with measured steps, their shadows long and dark on the frost-covered grass, while the witnesses arranged themselves at a safe distance, and Dr. Whitman positioned himself where he could quickly reach whichever man might require his services. "Take your marks, gentlemen," Lord Whitmore called, and the two adversaries turned their backs to each other, pistols held at the ready, while tension stretched tight as a bowstring across the heath. The wind had died to nothing, as if nature itself held its breath for what was to come. And in that terrible silence each man faced whatever thoughts and fears occupied his final moments before the command that would determine his fate. The sound of the pistols firing simultaneously shattered the morning silence like thunder, their reports echoing across the empty heath while acrid smoke drifted lazily in the still air, carrying with it the bitter scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Reginald's shot went wide, whether by design or the inevitable shakiness that affected even experienced marksmen in such circumstances, his ball embedding itself harmlessly in the trunk of a distant oak while he remained standing for one heart-stopping moment before Nathaniel's bullet found its mark. The impact spun the younger man around like a child's top, his own pistol flying from his grasp as he collapsed to the frost-covered grass with a cry of pain that cut through the morning air and sent Dr. Whitman running toward him with his medical bag clutched tightly in his experienced hands. Blood immediately began to stain Reginald's white shirt, spreading outward from the wound in his shoulder, while his face went pale as parchment, and his breathing became rapid and shallow from the shock of the impact. Nathaniel lowered his smoking pistol slowly, his face a mask of conflicted emotions as he watched the surgeon kneel beside his fallen opponent, and for a moment it seemed as though he might approach to offer assistance, or at least express regret for the necessity of what he had done. "The wound appears to be in the shoulder, well away from any vital organs," Dr. Whitman announced after his preliminary examination, "though there will be considerable damage to the muscle and possibly the bone depending on the bullet's path. We must get him to proper facilities immediately if we are to prevent infection or permanent disability." As the surgeon worked to stabilize his patient for transport, cutting away the bloodied fabric and applying pressure to slow the bleeding, Reginald remained conscious, though clearly in considerable pain, that he bore with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout this entire affair. Through gritted teeth and with obvious effort, he managed to speak words that shocked all present and transformed the entire nature of what had just occurred on this bleak stretch of London's outskirts. "Gentlemen," he said with difficulty, pausing frequently as waves of pain washed over him, but maintaining the clear diction of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I wish to make a formal statement before witnesses while I am still capable of clear thought and rational decision." The others gathered closer, recognizing the gravity of whatever pronouncement was about to be made by a man who might yet die from his wounds, despite the surgeon's optimistic assessment of their severity. Lord Whitmore produced a small notebook and pencil, prepared to record whatever legal or personal matters Reginald felt compelled to address before his condition potentially worsened beyond the point of coherent communication. "I hereby formally release Lady Cordelia Thornfield from all obligations arising from our marriage, both legal and moral," Reginald declared with as much strength as he could muster, his words carrying clearly despite their obvious cost in terms of physical suffering. I do this not from any fault or failing on her part, but in recognition that her heart belongs to another, and that love cannot be commanded or denied by ceremony or law. This magnanimous gesture, delivered through gritted teeth while the surgeon continued to probe for the bullet that remained lodged somewhere in the complex structure of his shoulder, transformed Reginald from rival to tragic hero in the space of a few remarkable sentences. His love for Cordelia proved deeper than his pride, generous enough to encompass her happiness even when it meant his own sacrifice, and those who witnessed his statement would carry the memory of his nobility for the rest of their lives. The Duke of Ravencrest has won not only this contest of arms, but the prize we both sought, Reginald continued with obvious effort, though I pray he proves more worthy of the gift he has received than I was able to be in my brief tenure as her husband. Benedict, who had remained silent throughout the duel itself, now rolled his chair closer to where the wounded man lay, his own pale face reflecting both admiration for Reginald's generosity and concern for his condition. "My lord, you honor my sister and our family with your magnanimity, but surely such decisions should not be made while you are suffering from shock and loss of blood. Perhaps when you have recovered from your wounds, you might reconsider this hasty dissolution of ties that were formed with such ceremony and celebration only yesterday." Reginald managed a weak smile that somehow retained all its characteristic warmth despite the circumstance, his eyes focusing on Benedict with obvious affection and respect. "My dear friend, these wounds may heal, but the truth they have revealed will not change with time or recovery. I would rather see Lady Cordelia happy with the man she has always loved than chained to a marriage that can bring neither of us joy, regardless of its practical advantages or social acceptability." Dr. Whitman had succeeded in extracting the bullet, a flattened piece of lead that he held up briefly before discarding it in the grass, and was now working to clean and bind the wound while his assistants prepared a makeshift stretcher for transport to his surgery in Harley Street. The bleeding had slowed considerably, and the surgeon's expression suggested cautious optimism about his patient's prospects for recovery, though the extent of any permanent damage would not be known for some time. "We must move him immediately," the doctor announced, looking up from his work with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "The wound is serious but manageable if we can prevent infection and ensure proper healing, but delay could prove fatal if complications arise." The sound of approaching hooves announced Cordelia's arrival just as Reginald was being carefully lifted onto the stretcher, her face a mask of horror and fury, as she took in the scene of bloodshed and masculine folly that had played out on this desolate patch of ground, while she had been helplessly confined to her chambers by the conventions that prevented ladies from witnessing such affairs. She had defied those conventions by coming here at all, riding hard across London with only a groom for company, driven by a desperate need to prevent the violence that she now saw had already reached its inevitable conclusion. Her riding habit was mud-splattered from the journey, her hair partially escaped from its confining pins, and her eyes blazed with an anger that encompassed both the wounded man being loaded into the waiting carriage and the victor who stood apart with his smoking pistol still in his hand. "Reginald," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside the stretcher without regard for her expensive clothing or the proprieties that demanded a lady maintain her dignity under all circumstances. "Forgive me, I beg you. This is all my fault, and you have suffered for my weakness and indecision." He reached up with his uninjured hand to touch her cheek gently, his fingers coming away wet with tears she had not realized she was shedding, his smile somehow maintaining its characteristic warmth, despite the pallor that spoke of pain and blood loss. "My dear Cordelia, you have nothing for which to apologize. I entered into our marriage with full knowledge that your heart belonged to another, and I hoped that time and kindness might eventually win your affection. But love cannot be forced or manufactured through ceremony and law, and I would rather see you happy than honor a contract that brings neither of us joy." Their brief conversation was heartbreaking in its tenderness and mutual respect. Two people who might have found contentment together under different circumstances now parted by the violence that male pride had demanded, and female devotion had been powerless to prevent. As the carriage rolled away toward London with its precious cargo, Cordelia watched until it disappeared around a bend in the road, her heart breaking for a good man whose only crime had been loving a woman whose heart was already given to another. Nathaniel approached slowly, his face reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had achieved victory at a cost that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, the weight of what he had done settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. When he attempted to speak to Cordelia, perhaps to explain his actions or express regret for their necessity, she turned on him with the cold fury of a woman who had witnessed too much suffering caused by masculine pride and the ancient codes that demanded blood for honor. "Do not dare to speak to me," she said with icy precision, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade forged from disappointment and rage. "You have won your duel, Your Grace, but honor gained through bloodshed is no honor at all, and if you think that Lord Thornfield's sacrifice has somehow cleared the path for your renewed suit, you are gravely mistaken about both my character and my intentions." Nathaniel stood frozen by her words, his face reflecting the dawning realization that his victory on the field of honor might prove hollow indeed if it had cost him any hope of regaining the woman for whose love he had been willing to risk everything. The grey morning seemed to grow darker around them as Cordelia continued her devastating rebuke, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage on a man who had just learned that some victories come at too high a price to be worth celebrating. "I will go to Thornfield House," she declared, with the kind of final authority that brooked no argument or appeal, "and I will nurse Lord Thornfield back to health regardless of his generous release of our marriage bonds. His magnanimity will not be wasted through my neglect, nor will your violence be rewarded with my acceptance, no matter what noble motives you believe justified this morning's work." The chapter concluded with Cordelia's departure, leaving Nathaniel standing alone on the battlefield where he had won everything and lost the only prize that mattered, while the morning sun finally broke through the clouds to illuminate a scene of triumph that felt more like defeat than victory. The grand estate of Thornfield Park spread across the Yorkshire countryside like a testament to generations of careful stewardship and accumulated wealth, its honey-coloured stone walls and mullioned windows gleaming in the pale autumn sunlight that filtered through the ancient oaks lining the sweeping drive. Cordelia had arrived 3 days after the duel with only a small travelling case and her lady's maid, determined to fulfill her promise to nurse Reginald back to health regardless of his generous release from their marriage bonds. The house itself seemed to welcome her with its warm panelling and comfortable furnishings, so different from the cold grandeur she had expected from such a magnificent estate. And the staff treated her with the respectful deference due to their master's wife, without any apparent knowledge of the dramatic circumstances that had brought her here. Reginald's chambers occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, with tall windows that looked out over gardens designed by Capability Brown himself, and it was here that Cordelia spent her days, monitoring his recovery with the devoted attention of a sister rather than a wife. The wound itself had seemed manageable at first, Dr. Whitman having expressed cautious optimism about the patient's prospects for full recovery, but complications had set in during the journey north that transformed what should have been a straightforward convalescence into a battle against fever and infection that tested both patient and caregiver. For nearly a week, Reginald drifted in and out of consciousness, while his temperature soared to dangerous levels, his body burning with the kind of fever that could either purge the infection from his system or consume his strength entirely. During these periods of delirium, he spoke constantly of someone named Catherine, his first wife, whose death in a riding accident 5 years earlier had left him devastated and emotionally withdrawn from all possibility of genuine attachment to another woman. "My dearest Catherine," he would whisper to the empty air, his voice broken with grief and longing. "Forgive me for trying to replace you with another. I know now that what we shared cannot be replicated or duplicated, and I should have honored your memory by remaining alone rather than attempting to build happiness on the foundation of practical arrangement and mutual convenience." These revelations, delivered in the helpless honesty of fever-induced confession, helped Cordelia understand the complexity of the man she had married and the true nature of his proposal, which had been motivated as much by his own need for emotional protection as by her financial desperation. Their marriage of convenience would have served both their purposes by providing her with security while shielding him from the vulnerability that came with deeper attachment and the risk of losing someone he truly loved. Catherine was perfection itself, he continued during one particularly difficult night when the fever peaked and Dr. Whitman feared they might lose him entirely. Her laugh like silver bells and her spirit so bright that she seemed to illuminate every room she entered. How could I have thought that duty and respect might substitute for the kind of love that transforms a man's very soul and makes him believe in possibilities beyond his previous understanding? Cordelia sat beside his bed through these long vigils, bathing his forehead with cool cloths and spooning broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, her heart breaking not for herself, but for this good man whose capacity for love had been damaged by loss, and who had sought refuge in a marriage that would have protected him from ever feeling such pain again. She began to understand that his kindness to her had been genuine, but also self-serving in its way. His recognition that her own damaged heart would never demand the kind of complete devotion that had made Catherine's loss so devastating. On the 7th morning, his fever finally broke in a rush of perspiration that left him weak but clear-eyed, and when he focused on her face with full awareness for the first time since the duel, his expression held a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been relief. "Cordelia," he said with difficulty, his voice barely above a whisper, "you should not be here. My release of our marriage bonds was sincere, and you owe me no duty that would require such devoted care from someone whose heart belongs to another." She smoothed the damp hair back from his forehead with gentle fingers, her touch conveying the sisterly affection that had grown between them during his illness. "Hush now, my lord. We can discuss such matters when you are stronger. For now, you must concentrate on recovering your health, and I will concentrate on ensuring that you receive the care necessary to achieve that goal." It was on this same morning that the housekeeper informed Cordelia that the Duke of Ravencrest had taken lodgings at the Rose and Crown in the village, making clear his intention to remain in the vicinity until such time as Lady Thornfield might consent to receive him. The news sent a jolt of conflicting emotions through her system, anger at his presumption warring with an unwilling awareness that his persistence spoke to feelings that had not been diminished by time or circumstance. She instructed the housekeeper to inform any callers that she was not receiving visitors, her tone brooking no argument about exceptions or special considerations that might apply to titled gentlemen with historical claims on her affection. "I will not see him," she told her reflection in the mirror that evening, as she prepared for another night's vigil beside Reginald's bed, though her own face seemed to contradict her words with its underlying sadness and the shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and internal conflict. "He may have won his duel, but that does not mean he has earned the right to my forgiveness or my attention through an act of violence that could have ended in tragedy for everyone involved." Benedict's condition had deteriorated alarmingly in the weeks following the duel, the excitement and emotional strain having accelerated a decline that his physicians had predicted would be gradual rather than precipitous, transforming their cautious timeline of months into a matter of weeks or perhaps even days if his current trajectory continued unchecked. The journey north to Yorkshire had been undertaken against medical advice, but his determination to be near his sister during her own crisis had overridden all practical considerations about his comfort or safety. Now he lay in a guest chamber at Thornfield Park, his breath coming in laboured gasps that spoke of lungs filling with the fluid that would eventually drown him. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his concern focused entirely on the emotional turmoil surrounding him, rather than his own approaching end. From his sickbed, he had assumed the unlikely role of counselor and confessor to all the principals in the drama that continued to unfold around him. His impending death lending a weight and urgency to his words that might have been lacking under normal circumstances. The knowledge that these might be his final opportunities to guide those he loved toward happiness rather than continued suffering drove him to speak with an honesty and directness that cut through the polite evasions and self-deceptions that had complicated everyone's thinking. It was Benedict who requested a private interview with Nathaniel on the third day of the Duke's vigil in the village, sending word through the housekeeper that a dying man wished to speak with him about matters of mutual concern before it became too late for such conversations. Nathaniel arrived within the hour, his appearance reflecting the toll that guilt and uncertainty had taken on a man accustomed to decisive action, but now faced with consequences that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each passing day. "Your Grace," Benedict began without preamble once they were alone in the chamber that had become his world, "I wish to absolve you of blame for the duel and its aftermath. You acted according to the code that governs gentlemen in such matters, and while I regret the necessity of violence, I cannot fault you for defending your honor when challenged by circumstances beyond your control." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably in the chair beside the bed, his hands clenched as he struggled with emotions that had been eating at him since the morning on Hampstead Heath. "Mr. Fairfax, you are kind to say so, but I cannot absolve myself so easily. I could have found another way to resolve the matter, could have accepted Lord Thornfield's offer of reconciliation rather than insisting on satisfaction through bloodshed. My pride and 3 years of suppressed anger led me to make choices that have brought pain to everyone involved, including your sister, who deserved better from the man who claims to love her." Benedict studied the younger man's face with the clear-eyed perception that approaching death often brings, seeing past the surface guilt to the deeper anguish of someone who had won a victory that felt more like defeat. "Your love for Cordelia is not in question, Your Grace, but love expressed through grand gestures and dramatic confrontations is less valuable than love demonstrated through consistent service and selfless action. If you truly wish to prove yourself worthy of her regard, consider how you might use your influence and resources to benefit others rather than simply pursuing your own happiness." The suggestion that followed was both practical and inspired, born from Benedict's lifelong observation of his sister's character and his understanding of what would truly touch her heart rather than simply impress her mind. Establish a charitable foundation in Cordelia's name, focusing on medical care for those who cannot afford the treatment that might save their lives or ease their suffering. Use your ducal connections and considerable wealth to create something lasting that will serve others long after the current crisis has been resolved one way or another. Such work would demonstrate the depth of your commitment while honoring the compassionate nature that has always been Cordelia's greatest strength. Nathaniel listened with growing understanding as Benedict outlined his vision for a network of clinics and hospitals that could serve the poor throughout England, funded by the Duke's resources but managed by trustees chosen for their dedication to healing rather than their social connections. The project would require years of careful planning and implementation, demanding the kind of sustained commitment that went far beyond the passionate intensity of romantic pursuit, but spoke to the deeper qualities that made a man worthy of a good woman's love. "It is a remarkable idea," Nathaniel admitted, his expression thoughtful as he considered the practical challenges and the potential impact of such an undertaking. "But will Cordelia see it as genuine service or merely another attempt to win her favor through impressive displays of wealth and influence?" Benedict smiled weakly, his breath coming in short gasps that reminded both men of the urgency underlying their conversation. "That, Your Grace, will depend entirely on how you approach the work itself. If you truly dedicate yourself to serving those in need, rather than simply creating monuments to your own generosity, if you work quietly and consistently without seeking recognition or gratitude, then even Cordelia's wounded heart will eventually recognize the sincerity of your transformation." The conversation with Reginald, when his health permitted such exertion, focused on different themes but carried the same underlying message about the difference between obligation and genuine affection in human relationships. Benedict expressed profound gratitude for the Earl's kindness and generosity of spirit, particularly his magnificent gesture in releasing Cordelia from their marriage bonds, despite his own feelings and the practical advantages the union would have provided. "My lord, you have shown a nobility of character that humbles me," Benedict said during one of Reginald's more lucid moments, when the fever had receded enough to permit coherent conversation. "Your willingness to sacrifice your own happiness for Cordelia's demonstrates the kind of selfless love that few men ever achieve, and I hope you know that neither my sister nor I will ever forget such generosity." Reginald, still pale and weak from his ordeal, but no longer delirious, managed a genuine smile that transformed his drawn features and reminded Benedict of the man's essential goodness, despite the tragic circumstances that surrounded them all. "Mr. Fairfax, I have come to understand during this illness that my feelings for your sister, while genuine, were based more on admiration and respect than the kind of deep attachment that justifies marriage between two people. I cared for her welfare and appreciated her character, but I was not truly in love with her in the way that she deserves to be loved. Perhaps my greatest gift to Cordelia is not my hand in marriage, but my friendship and continued support as she navigates whatever future awaits her." Benedict nodded approvingly, recognizing the wisdom in Reginald's assessment and the maturity required to acknowledge the difference between affection and love, between desire for companionship and the deeper connection that could sustain a marriage through all the challenges that life inevitably presented. "Your friendship will be a treasure more valuable than any marriage based on convenience rather than passion," he assured the younger man. "And perhaps in time, when your heart has fully healed from the loss of your Catherine, you will find someone who can appreciate both your kindness and your capacity for the kind of love that transforms both people involved." Most importantly, Benedict reserved his frankest conversation for Cordelia herself, speaking to her about forgiveness and the danger of allowing past hurts to poison future happiness when she could have been building something beautiful instead of nursing grievances that served no productive purpose. "My dearest sister," he said one evening when exhaustion had driven her to seek respite in his chamber rather than continuing her vigil beside Reginald's bed, "you have always been the wisest and most compassionate member of our family. But in this matter, you are allowing anger to cloud your judgment in ways that will ultimately bring you more pain rather than the satisfaction you seek." She had been arranging his medicines with the kind of precise attention that helped her avoid thinking about larger questions, but his words forced her to meet his knowing gaze and confront truths she had been avoiding through constant activity and determined focus on immediate practical matters. "Benedict, you do not understand what it was like to watch two men I care about shed blood over something that could have been resolved through rational discussion rather than violence. The sight of Reginald lying wounded while Nathaniel stood with a smoking pistol in his hand will haunt me for the rest of my life, and I cannot simply forget such images because time has passed or because Nathaniel claims to regret his actions. Benedict's expression held infinite compassion, mixed with the urgency of someone who knew his opportunities for guidance were rapidly diminishing as his body failed and his time grew short. Cordelia. Punishing Nathaniel for actions taken in defense of his honor serves no one's interests, least of all your own. You loved him once with your whole heart, and unless I am greatly mistaken, you love him still despite the pain his absence caused and the violence that marked his return. Forgiveness does not require you to forget what happened or to pretend that his choices were perfect, but it does require you to consider whether continued anger brings you peace or merely prolongs the suffering that has already cost all of you too much. The Yorkshire moors had exploded into their autumn glory, painting the landscape in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to glow with inner fire beneath the slanted light of October afternoon, while Thornfield Park stood like an island of cultivated beauty amid the wild splendor that stretched endlessly toward distant hills. It had been 3 weeks since Reginald's fever broke, and his steady recovery had freed Cordelia from the intensive nursing duties that had provided blessed distraction from the turmoil in her own heart, leaving her with long hours to contemplate the presence of the man who waited patiently in the village for some sign that she might consent to see him. The knowledge that Nathaniel took his meals at the Rose and Crown, that he walked the moorland paths each morning and evening, that his patient vigil continued despite her continued refusal to receive him, created a constant awareness that no amount of determined activity could entirely suppress. Finally, on an afternoon when the golden light seemed to make everything beautiful and the autumn air carried promises of winter's approach, she sent word through the housekeeper that she would consent to walk with His Grace in the gardens, though she specified that such consent should not be interpreted as forgiveness or renewed favor. The message was delivered with all the formal precision that years of service in great houses had taught the staff, but Cordelia suspected that her true feelings were not entirely hidden from servants who had observed her restlessness, and the way her eyes turned toward the village whenever she stood at the windows. When Nathaniel arrived at the appointed hour, she was struck anew by the changes that 3 years and recent suffering had wrought in his appearance. The lines around his eyes speaking of responsibilities beyond his years and sorrows that had aged him in ways that mere time could not account for. He was still devastatingly handsome, still possessed of the commanding presence that had first captured her attention in a London ballroom that now seemed part of another lifetime, but there was a gravity about him now that suggested hard-won wisdom rather than the easy confidence of inherited privilege. "Your Grace," she said with carefully maintained formality, as they began to walk along the gravelled paths that wound between carefully tended flower beds and ancient yew hedges shaped by generations of patient gardeners. "I have agreed to this meeting, not because I have forgiven the violence of recent weeks, but because my brother believes that continued anger serves no useful purpose and only prolongs suffering that has already extracted too high a price from everyone involved." Nathaniel walked beside her with careful attention to maintaining proper distance, his hands clasped behind his back as though he dared not risk even accidental contact that might be unwelcome, his voice when he spoke carrying none of its former easy authority. "Lady Cordelia, I am grateful for any opportunity to explain circumstances that I should have revealed years ago, before misunderstanding and wounded pride created tragedies that might have been avoided through honest communication rather than noble silence. I do not ask for forgiveness, which I have not earned, but only for the chance to ensure that you understand the choices I made and the reasons that drove me to make them. Their conversation unfolded over several such meetings, each carefully chaperoned by the presence of the elderly head gardener, who worked within sight though beyond hearing, his tactful supervision allowing for private speech while maintaining the proprieties that protected Cordelia's reputation. With each encounter, more of the pain both had carried for 3 years was revealed and examined, the accumulated misunderstandings slowly giving way to clearer understanding of the impossible choices that circumstances had forced upon them both. Nathaniel's explanation of his 3-year absence proved even more heartbreaking in its complete telling than Millicent's earlier summary had suggested. His description of arriving at the family estate to find chaos and near ruin painting a picture of agonizing decisions made in isolation, while the woman he loved remained ignorant of his struggles. "Cordelia," he said during their 3rd such meeting, standing beside a fountain where stone dolphins played eternally in water that caught and reflected the autumn light, "I cannot adequately describe the agony of choosing between love and duty when both seemed to demand sacrifices that would destroy everything I held dear. I believed then, and still believe now, that you deserved better than a man who could offer only debt and uncertainty, whose circumstances would have dragged you down into the kind of genteel poverty that slowly destroys the spirit while maintaining the appearance of respectability." His marriage to Vivian was revealed in its full complexity, a carefully orchestrated business transaction that had saved not only the estate, but the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on its continued prosperity, while costing him every hope of personal happiness he had ever entertained. Lady Vivian understood perfectly the nature of our arrangement, Nathaniel continued, his voice heavy with remembered sorrow. She needed the prestige of becoming a duchess while I needed her dowry to satisfy creditors who cared nothing for ancient bloodlines or noble intentions. We conducted ourselves with mutual respect and careful consideration, but there was never any pretense of affection between us. Never any possibility that our union might grow into the kind of love that I had known with you and believed I would never experience again. Cordelia found herself deeply moved by his honesty, her anger slowly giving way to understanding as she recognized the parallels between his impossible situation and her own recent choices regarding Lord Thornfield. Both had been driven to marriages of convenience by circumstances beyond their control. Both had sacrificed personal happiness in service to what seemed the greater good, and both had suffered in ways that their pride had prevented them from revealing to the one person who might have understood and shared their burden. During her own turns at confession, she shared the gradual erosion of their family circumstances, the mounting medical expenses for Benedict's care, the increasing desperation that had made Lord Thornfield's proposal seem like salvation rather than compromise. I told myself that affection might grow where love was absent, she admitted during one particularly painful conversation as they walked among the roses that still bloomed despite the approaching frost. Lord Thornfield is everything admirable in a gentleman, kind and generous and worthy of respect, but my heart remained stubbornly fixed on a love I believed was lost forever. My engagement to him was as much a practical arrangement as your marriage to Lady Vivian, though I convinced myself that duty and gratitude were sufficient foundations for a happy life. Both acknowledged that their suffering had been largely self-inflicted, born from pride and misplaced nobility that had prevented either from reaching out during the darkest moments when honest communication might have changed everything. The knowledge that they had endured 3 years of unnecessary separation, that both had made substantial sacrifices based on assumptions about the other's feelings and circumstances, created a bitter irony that threatened to overshadow any possibility of redemption. But it was during their 4th meeting, as the afternoon light began to fail and the first hint of winter's chill touched the air, that Nathaniel presented her with a leather portfolio containing detailed plans for the medical foundation he proposed to establish in her name, the gesture demonstrating that he had learned to channel his passion constructively rather than destructively. "Cordelia," he said with evident emotion as she examined the carefully drafted documents that outlined a network of clinics and hospitals designed to serve those who could not afford proper medical care, "this foundation would be my attempt to honor both your compassionate nature and Benedict's wisdom about the difference between grand gestures and genuine service. If you will permit me to proceed, I will dedicate the remainder of my life to building something that might ease the suffering of others, while proving that my love for you has grown beyond selfish desire into something that might actually benefit the world." The plans were remarkably comprehensive, detailing everything from the selection of suitable locations to the recruitment and training of physicians willing to serve the poor, from the establishment of teaching programs that would increase the number of qualified medical practitioners to the creation of research facilities that might advance the understanding of diseases that disproportionately affected those without means to seek the finest care. The scope and ambition of the project spoke to months of careful planning and consultation with medical experts, legal advisors, and charitable organizations that already worked among the disadvantaged populations of England's growing industrial cities. "This is extraordinary," she said softly, her fingers tracing the architectural drawings that showed clean, well-equipped facilities designed to provide dignity along with healing to patients who had never experienced either in their previous encounters with medical care. Such an undertaking would require years of dedication and enormous resources, with little prospect of recognition or gratitude from those it served. Nathaniel watched her face carefully as she continued to study the documents, his expression reflecting both hope and resignation as he waited for her response to what amounted to a proposal for how he might spend the rest of his life in service to ideals she had always championed. "That is precisely the point, Cordelia. I have learned from bitter experience that the pursuit of personal happiness alone leads only to tragedy and regret. But service to something larger than oneself provides purpose and meaning that can sustain a man through any difficulty. Whether or not you can ever find it in your heart to forgive my past mistakes, I hope you will allow me to proceed with this work as a memorial to your brother's wisdom and a testament to the transformative power of love properly directed." Reginald had recovered sufficiently to manage the journey back to London by the time the first November frost silvered the gardens at Thornfield Park, though his left arm remained noticeably weaker than before and would likely never regain its full strength, a permanent reminder of the morning when masculine honor had demanded satisfaction through powder and shot. His departure had been planned for weeks, both to allow him proper time to arrange his London affairs and to give Cordelia space to continue her careful conversations with Nathaniel without the complications that arose from having both men under the same roof. Yet before taking his leave of Yorkshire, Reginald requested a private audience with both Cordelia and Nathaniel, his manner suggesting that he had reached some important decision during his convalescence that required formal communication before his departure. The meeting was arranged for the morning room at Thornfield, with its comfortable chairs arranged before tall windows that looked out over the parkland toward the village where Nathaniel had maintained his patient vigil for nearly a month, creating a setting that seemed appropriately dignified for whatever announcement their host intended to make. When the three were assembled, with Reginald still somewhat pale, but clearly in full possession of his faculties, he began to speak with the kind of careful formality that suggested he had rehearsed his words during the long hours of recovery and reflection that recent weeks had provided. "My dear friends, for I hope I may call you both friends despite the unusual circumstances that have brought us together, I have asked you here to formalize certain decisions that my recent experience has helped clarify in ways that might not have been possible under different circumstances. Lady Cordelia, Your Grace, you have both shown me kindnesses during my recovery that I will remember with gratitude for whatever years remain to me, and I hope that what I am about to propose will serve your interests as well as my own sense of what honor and justice demand in this situation." He paused to gather strength, the effort of sustained speech still taxing despite his general improvement, while his audience waited with the kind of respectful attention that his measured words seemed to deserve. "I wish to formalize my release of Lady Cordelia from all obligations arising from our brief marriage, not merely as a gesture of magnanimity, but as a legal reality that will allow her complete freedom to pursue whatever future seems most likely to bring her happiness. Our union, while conducted with all proper ceremony, was never truly consummated in the way that canon law requires for a binding marriage, and combined with my voluntary relinquishment of all claims, this creates grounds for annulment that even the most conservative ecclesiastical authorities would be bound to recognize. The revelation came as a shock to Cordelia, who had assumed that their marriage, however brief and interrupted by tragedy, had created legal obligations that could be dissolved only through the complex and potentially scandalous process of divorce. The possibility of annulment offered a clean resolution that would leave her reputation intact, while freeing her to make whatever choices her heart dictated without the complications of existing marital bonds. "Lord Thornfield," she said with obvious emotion, "such generosity goes far beyond anything I had any right to expect, and I hardly know how to express my gratitude for a gift that restores possibilities I had believed lost forever." Reginald smiled with evident pleasure at her response, though his expression also held the kind of peaceful resignation that suggested he had found unexpected comfort in his decision to relinquish claims that honor might have supported, but love could not sustain. "Lady Cordelia, your happiness has become important to me in ways that transcend any legal or romantic connection we might have shared, and I have come to understand that true affection sometimes requires the wisdom to step aside when someone else can provide what you most need and deserve." The conversation took an even more surprising turn when Reginald addressed Nathaniel directly, offering not merely his blessing for a renewed courtship, but active partnership in the charitable work that had become the Duke's proposed path to redemption. "Your Grace, I have studied the plans you shared with Lady Cordelia for your proposed medical foundation, and I would be honored to contribute both financial resources and my own knowledge of rural healthcare needs gained through years of managing estates in areas where qualified physicians are scarce and medical care often non-existent. My lands in Derbyshire and Somerset could provide excellent locations for some of your proposed clinics, and my connections with local magistrates and landowners might facilitate the kind of community support that such institutions require to succeed in serving those who need them most." Nathaniel appeared genuinely moved by this unexpected offer, his expression reflecting amazement that a man who had every reason to consider him an enemy would instead propose to become an ally in work that was motivated partly by desire to win back the woman they had both loved. "Lord Thornfield, such generosity of spirit humbles me completely," he replied with obvious sincerity. "After everything that has passed between us, after the violence that nearly cost you your life, you offer partnership rather than enmity. I cannot adequately express how much such trust means to me or how determined I am to prove worthy of it through dedication to the work we would share." Reginald's response carried the kind of quiet authority that had always characterized his approach to life's challenges, whether personal or professional, reflecting a maturity that recent suffering had refined rather than diminished. "Your Grace, we are both men who have learned difficult lessons about the difference between selfish desire and genuine love, between the pursuit of personal satisfaction and service to something larger than ourselves. If we can channel our shared concern for Lady Cordelia's welfare into work that serves others, then perhaps some good can emerge from the pain that recent events have caused all of us. The meeting concluded with formal arrangements for the legal proceedings that would dissolve Cordelia's marriage while establishing the framework for the charitable foundation that would unite former rivals in common cause, transforming a story of masculine competition into one of collaborative service. As Reginald prepared to depart for London the following morning, he took his final leave of Cordelia with words that would stay with her long after his carriage disappeared down the drive leading away from Thornfield Park. "My dear Lady Cordelia," he said as they stood together in the entrance hall, where servants waited with his travelling cases, "I want you to know that our brief acquaintance has taught me valuable lessons about the nature of love and the importance of recognizing when someone's heart belongs so completely to another that attempting to win it would be both futile and cruel. The Duke of Ravencrest is a fortunate man, and I hope he proves worthy of the treasure he has been given a second chance to claim." The first snow of December had begun to fall with gentle persistence as Benedict lay in his chambers at Thornfield Park, his breathing so laboured that each rise and fall of his chest seemed to require enormous effort, while his eyes retained the clarity that had always been his greatest gift, even as his body prepared to surrender its long battle against the consumption that had claimed so many months of his young life. The physicians had withdrawn their medicines and spoken in hushed tones about comfort rather than cure, acknowledging what Benedict himself had long accepted with the kind of graceful resignation that characterized his approach to every challenge life had presented. He had requested that both Cordelia and Nathaniel be summoned to his bedside for what would undoubtedly be their final conversation. His remaining strength carefully husbanded for words that needed to be spoken while he still possessed the breath to shape them into the blessing and challenge he intended to leave as his legacy. The room was warm despite the winter wind that rattled the windows, warmed by the fire that burned steadily in the grate, and by the love of those who had gathered to honor a man whose brief life had touched so many hearts with its combination of wisdom and gentle humor. Cordelia sat on one side of the bed, her hand clasped gently in his with the kind of careful attention that spoke to how fragile the connection had become, while Nathaniel stood respectfully near the window where the falling snow created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the emotional complexity of the moment they were sharing. "My dearest sister," Benedict began, his voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying the warmth that had always made his counsel so precious to those who sought his guidance. "You have spent these past months learning to forgive and to love again, but I fear you may now be tempted to transform grief into another kind of prison that prevents you from embracing the joy that awaits." His words were punctuated by pauses for breath that grew longer and more necessary as the effort of sustained speech took its toll on his failing strength, but his message was too important to be abbreviated or left incomplete. "I want you to promise me that you will not honor my memory through perpetual mourning, or by refusing the happiness that has been offered to you through circumstances that were painful but ultimately transformative. Love honored through living fully serves the departed better than endless lamentation, and I could not rest peacefully knowing that my death had become another obstacle to the contentment you have struggled so hard to achieve." Cordelia's tears fell silently as she listened to words that revealed the depth of his concern for her future welfare, even as his own future dwindled to a matter of hours rather than days or weeks. "Benedict," she managed to whisper through her emotion, "how can I think of happiness when losing you feels like losing the best part of myself, the part that understood goodness and wisdom and all the gentle virtues that made life beautiful despite its difficulties?" His smile, though weak, carried all the affection and understanding that had sustained her through every crisis of her adult life, and his response demonstrated the same insight that had made him such an invaluable counselor throughout the recent troubles that had tested everyone's character and resolve. Because, my beloved sister, the virtues you admire in me were learned from watching you face impossible choices with grace and courage, and they will survive my death because they have become part of your own character through years of practice and refinement. The happiness I want for you is not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of love that is strong enough to encompass both joy and grief without being destroyed by either. When he turned his attention to Nathaniel, Benedict's expression grew more serious as he prepared to entrust the most precious thing in his life to a man whose worthiness had been proven through months of patient service and demonstrated change. "Your Grace," he said with as much formality as his condition permitted, "I am placing my sister's happiness in your care, not because she requires protection or guidance from any man, but because love shared increases joy, while divided sorrow becomes bearable. You must promise me that you will honor not only her heart, but her independence, that she will remain free to pursue her own interests and passions, rather than being transferred from my care to yours as though she were property to be managed, rather than a partner to be cherished." Nathaniel stepped closer to the bed, his own emotion evident in the tightness around his eyes and the careful control of his voice as he responded to this final charge from the man whose approval had become so important to his hopes for redemption. "Mr. Fairfax, you have my word as a gentleman and my oath as a man who loves your sister more than his own life that I will spend whatever years remain to me ensuring her happiness while respecting her autonomy, supporting her ambitions while sharing my own, creating a partnership where both individuals flourish rather than a marriage where one simply serves the other's needs." The conversation continued in whispers and silences as Benedict's strength ebbed like a tide gradually withdrawing from the shore, leaving behind the gifts of wisdom and blessing that would sustain those he loved through the grief of his passing and the challenges of the future they would build together. His final words were for Cordelia, spoken so softly that she had to lean close to hear them above the sound of his increasingly labored breathing. "Live boldly, my darling sister," he whispered with the last of his strength. "Love deeply, serve others, find joy in small moments as well as great ones. And remember that every day you choose happiness over sorrow is a day when my spirit rejoices with yours." He died peacefully as the snow continued to fall outside the windows, his breathing simply becoming slower and more gentle until it ceased altogether while Cordelia held one hand and Nathaniel the other, their shared vigil creating a bridge between grief and hope that would sustain them through the difficult months ahead. The funeral was held on a day of crystalline beauty when the snow had stopped falling and the world seemed purified by winter's touch, with services conducted in the small church where Benedict had worshipped during his stay in Yorkshire, and attended by everyone whose life he had touched during his brief but meaningful existence. His burial took place in the churchyard overlooking the moors he had learned to love during his final months, with a simple stone that bore his name and the dates that bracketed a life measured not in years, but in the wisdom he had shared, and the love he had given to those fortunate enough to know him. Spring arrived in 1816 with the kind of gentle warmth that made the Yorkshire countryside a paradise of new growth and unlimited possibility, transforming the moors from winter's stark beauty into rolling expanses of green that stretched toward horizons bright with hope and promise. The chapel at Ravencrest had been carefully prepared for a ceremony that would be small in scale but profound in significance, its ancient stones witnessing the union of two souls who had traveled through separation and suffering to reach an understanding of love that transcended mere romance to encompass service and sacrifice, and the deeper bonds that sustain human beings through every trial that life presents. The marriage between Nathaniel and Cordelia took place exactly 1 year after the duel that had nearly destroyed them all. The timing chosen not from superstition, but from a shared recognition that the anniversary should mark triumph rather than tragedy, transformation rather than mere survival of the violence that had threatened to define their relationship rather than refine it. The guest list was deliberately limited to those whose presence would enhance rather than complicate the joy of the occasion, creating an intimate gathering that reflected the quiet dignity both bride and groom had come to prefer over the elaborate social spectacles that had once seemed so important in their younger years. Araminta served as matron of honor with the kind of delighted efficiency that characterized all her undertakings. Having spent weeks ensuring that every detail reflected the genuine affection and hard-won wisdom that the couple brought to their union, rather than merely conforming to fashionable expectations about what such ceremonies should include. Her own happiness at seeing Cordelia finally united with the man who had always held her heart was evident in every gesture and expression, creating an atmosphere of celebration that honored both the joy of the present moment and the memory of those who could not be there to witness it. Lady Millicent wept happy tears throughout the entire ceremony, her emotional response reflecting not only sisterly affection for Nathaniel, but genuine fondness for the woman who had become so important to her family's happiness and redemption. Reginald's presence as witness came as a surprise to many who knew the history of the relationships involved, but his attendance demonstrated the remarkable friendship that had grown from the ashes of rivalry and the mutual respect that had developed between men who had learned to honor each other's character, despite the conflicts that circumstances had created. The service itself was simple but profound, conducted by the elderly rector who had christened Nathaniel and watched him grow from a rebellious boy into a man worthy of the responsibilities his birth had placed upon his shoulders. Their vows referenced the trials they had endured and the wisdom they had gained through experiences that might have destroyed lesser loves, but had instead forged bonds strong enough to withstand whatever future challenges awaited them. When Nathaniel spoke his promises to love Cordelia in certainty and in doubt, in presence and in absence, in honor and in humility, the words carried weight earned through months of patient service and demonstrated change that transformed traditional phrases into deeply personal commitments. Cordelia's own vows reflected the same hard-won understanding of love's true nature, promising not just fidelity and obedience as tradition demanded, but partnership in service to others and mutual support in the work they had chosen to pursue together. Her voice remained steady as she spoke of choosing to build something lasting rather than merely enjoying something beautiful, of committing herself not just to a man, but to a shared vision of how their love might benefit a world that had already received too little compassion and practical aid from those with the means to provide both. The exchange of rings took place beneath windows that cast colored light across their joined hands, the ancient ceremony linking them not just to each other, but to centuries of couples who had stood in similar churches, making similar promises while believing, as they believed, that love could overcome any obstacle and create meaning from even the most difficult circumstances. When the rector pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled witnesses felt themselves in the presence of something larger than romance, something approaching the sacred transformation that occurs when two individuals choose to become something greater than the sum of their separate parts. The wedding breakfast at Ravencrest was elegant but intimate, served in the great hall that had witnessed centuries of family celebrations and sorrows, its ancient walls now echoing with laughter and conversation that spoke of new beginnings rather than mere continuation of old traditions. Reginald offered a toast that perfectly captured the complexity of their shared history while celebrating the hope of their common future, his words acknowledging the pain that had brought them to this point, while emphasizing the joy that made such pain seem worthwhile in retrospect. The Benedict Ashworth Institute held its dedication ceremony the following month, with the first clinic opening its doors in a village not far from Thornfield Park, where the need for accessible medical care had been evident for years to anyone with eyes to see and hearts to feel compassion for suffering that wealth and privilege could easily ignore. The ceremony was attended by local dignitaries, medical professionals who had committed themselves to serving patients, regardless of their ability to pay, and families whose children would benefit from the care that would now be available to them without regard to their parents' financial circumstances. Reginald served as the Institute's first president, bringing to the position not only his administrative experience and social connections, but a genuine understanding of rural healthcare needs gained through years of managing estates where qualified physicians were scarce and medical emergencies often became tragedies simply because help was too distant or too expensive to obtain in time. Cordelia found herself deeply involved in the Institute's administration, her intelligence and organizational skills perfectly suited to the complex task of coordinating multiple locations while maintaining standards of care that honored Benedict's memory and served the mission they had all embraced as their tribute to his life and wisdom. 2 years had passed since that spring wedding when Cordelia stood in the gardens of Ravencrest, watching Nathaniel play with their infant son, Benedict Nathaniel Blackwood, whose sturdy limbs and bright eyes suggested he had inherited the best qualities of both parents along with the robust health that had been denied to his namesake uncle. The child's laughter rang across the carefully tended grounds like music, punctuating the gentle conversation between father and son that consisted mainly of nonsense words and silly faces, but conveyed depths of affection that needed no sophisticated vocabulary to communicate effectively. Reginald had become a regular visitor to Ravencrest, his friendship with both Cordelia and Nathaniel having deepened into the kind of lasting bond that transcends the romantic complications of their shared past to become something more valuable than mere cordial acquaintance, but less complicated than family relationships with their attendant obligations and expectations. His role as the child's godfather suited his temperament perfectly, providing him with opportunities to indulge paternal instincts without the daily responsibilities of marriage and parenthood that might have proved challenging for someone whose heart remained dedicated to the memory of his first wife, Catherine. The Institute had grown beyond their most optimistic projections, now operating 5 clinics across England, with detailed plans for expansion into areas where the need for accessible healthcare remained acute and the local infrastructure inadequate to meet the demands of growing industrial populations. Each new facility was carefully planned to serve its particular community while maintaining the standards of care and dignity that had characterized the original clinic, creating a network of medical assistants that was beginning to demonstrate the practical benefits of organized charitable effort over random acts of individual generosity. Cordelia had discovered in the Institute's administration not just satisfying work, but a genuine calling that utilized her intelligence and organizational abilities while providing the deep satisfaction that comes from service to others whose need is greater than one's own capacity to fully address, but not so overwhelming as to make effort seem futile. Her involvement in selecting locations, recruiting physicians, and establishing operational procedures had proven that her capabilities extended far beyond the traditional domestic sphere that society expected to contain feminine ambition and energy. The partnership between husband and wife in this endeavor had created a model of marriage that blended personal affection with shared purpose, demonstrating that love need not be diminished by allowing each partner to pursue individual interests and develop separate competencies that enriched rather than threatened their common life. As she reflected on their journey from separation through anguish to the contentment they now shared, Cordelia understood that their love had needed to be tested and refined by sacrifice and proven through service to others before it could achieve the depth and resilience that now characterized their relationship. The duel that might have destroyed them had instead become the catalyst for transformation, forcing both to examine their assumptions about honor and duty and love itself, while discovering that true strength came not from winning conflicts, but from finding ways to serve something larger than personal desire or individual happiness. The evening light was beginning to slant across the gardens when Nathaniel approached, carrying their son in his arms, his expression reflecting the deep contentment of a man who had found his proper place in the world through the combination of love freely given and work that served others rather than merely advancing his own interests or satisfying his personal ambitions. Their conversation as they walked together toward the house mingled practical concerns about the next clinic's location with private endearments about their son's development and their own plans for the future, creating the kind of easy intimacy that spoke of partnership in all aspects of life rather than mere romantic attachment or formal domestic arrangement. "We have received 3 applications for new clinic sites," Nathaniel said, as they paused beside the fountain, where stone dolphins played eternally in water that caught and reflected the golden light of approaching sunset. "The magistrates in Cornwall seem particularly eager to provide land and local support, while the industrial towns in Lancashire offer the greatest need, but also the most complex challenges in terms of serving populations that include both factory workers and rural families." Cordelia shifted the baby to her other arm, while considering the practical implications of each possibility, her mind already working through the logistics of staffing and funding and community relations that would determine the success or failure of any new undertaking. "Cornwall would allow us to test our model in a more traditional rural setting," she mused, "while Lancashire would force us to adapt our approach to serve the new urban populations that represent England's future, whether we are prepared for that future or not." Their discussion continued as they entered the house where dinner awaited and the evening's correspondence required attention, but the blend of business concerns with personal affection, of practical planning with intimate endearments, perfectly illustrated how they had learned to integrate duty and love into something stronger than either could achieve alone. The story of their separation and reunion, their suffering and redemption, had become the foundation for a partnership that honored both individual growth and shared commitment, while serving others whose needs reminded them daily that love's greatest expression was not its intensity, but its generosity.